Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Scene. Tonight, we are heading out onto very cold water. Not in any dramatic hurry, not with searchlights swinging wildly or people shouting over the wind, nothing like that. We're only going to drift there slowly, the way a good late-night story should. We're going to make our way north into the upper Great Lakes, into a part of the map that looks calm when you glance at it in daylight and much less friendly when you imagine it in November. And somewhere out there, between steel grey sky and steel grey water, we're going to spend some time with one of the most famous shipwrecks in North American history. This is the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Even if you have never seen Lake Superior in person, the name tends to do something to people. It has a weight to it. It sounds large. It sounds cold. It sounds like the sort of place where a sensible person might say, maybe I will stay inside with a blanket and let the lake have its privacy. And for much of the year, that is probably excellent advice. But large lakes have a way of confusing us. They sit there on maps looking tidy and contained, as if they are just oversized ponds with ambitions. Then weather comes in, the water darkens, the wind begins doing whatever it likes, and everyone is reminded that these are inland seas in all but name. They can build waves taller than houses. They can hide wrecks for decades. They can look flat and harmless one day and deeply unwelcoming the next. Lake Superior in particular has a long record of making sure human beings never get too smug around it. And somewhere in that record, there is one story that refuses to sink quietly into the background. What really happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald? That question has been asked for decades now, by sailors, divers, historians, families, engineers, people who grew up near the lakes, and people who only know the story because they heard the name once and felt some small chill go through them. Because this was not a little fishing boat slipping away in silence. This was a giant, a workhorse, a ship so large, so familiar and so solid looking, that many people assumed it could handle almost anything the lakes could throw at it. Then, one November evening in 1975, it vanished. No distress call in the usual sense. No long public struggle carried live to the world. No dramatic farewell. Just a few final messages, worsening weather, a dark stretch of water, and then nothing where a ship had been only moments before. If you're listening from somewhere warm tonight, maybe under a blanket, maybe on a sofa, maybe with the light low and your phone already threatening to slide out of your hand, take a second and notice the room around you. Is it quiet where you are, or is there a small hum in the background? A fan? A distant road? A refrigerator doing its best impression of a thoughtful old philosopher? And where are you listening from tonight? A city apartment? A small town? Somewhere near water? Somewhere very far from it? I always like that thought, that these stories go out into all kinds of rooms and all kinds of lives, while outside there are different temperatures, different weather, different clocks, and probably at least one person listening who should have gone to sleep 20 minutes ago, but decided a vanished freighter on Lake Superior sounded like a reasonable detour. Honestly, I respect that. And while you settle in, if you find this kind of storytelling soothing, you can always like the video, subscribe to the channel, and spend a little more time here with me on future nights. Life Beyond Scene is exactly for this sort of journey. We take things that are strange, historical, overlooked, unsettling, or simply larger than they first appear, and we sit with them long enough for the details to come into focus. No rushing, no noise for the sake of noise, just a careful look at what happened, who was there, and why certain stories stay with us. This one has stayed with people for a very long time. Part of that is the scale of it, part of it is the mystery, and part of it, I think, is the setting. A ship vanishing on an ocean already feels serious. A ship vanishing on a lake feels somehow wrong. Lakes, in the popular imagination, are where you go for cabins, holidays, and postcards with pine trees in the background. Lakes are meant to be manageable, friendly even. The Great Lakes do not care what image problem they may have. They are huge, powerful, and perfectly capable of producing storms that would make a smaller body of water sit down and reconsider its life choices. Lake Superior is the biggest of them all by surface area, and it has its own personality. Cold, deep, capable of staying ice cold far below the surface even when the season looks mild on paper. Sailors have respected it for generations, and respect is the right word. Not fear all the time, not romance all the time, but respect. Because that lake has a way of keeping score. By the time the Edmund Fitzgerald entered the picture, the Great Lakes were already full of commercial traffic. All boats, freighters, bulk carriers, ships built less for glamour than for work. They hauled iron ore, coal, grain, stone, and all the heavy materials that quietly keep industries moving. They were practical vessels in a practical system, and the Fitzgerald belonged to that world. But it also stood out inside it. It was big, modern for its time, and impressive enough that people noticed it. Children pointed it out from shore. Newspapers wrote about it. Captains knew its name. When it entered service, it was the largest ship on the Great Lakes, and that matters because size changes how a ship lives in public memory. A very large vessel starts to feel less like transportation and more like architecture that moves. You do not easily imagine architecture disappearing, and yet that is exactly what happened. Still, before we get to the storm and before we get to the theories, the investigations, the arguments about waves, shoals, structural failure, hatch covers, bottoming out, and all the rest of the puzzle pieces that people have been trying to arrange for half a century, it helps to slow down and sit in the world the ship belonged to. Picture the Great Lakes shipping season in the 1970s. Long freighters moving through cold water under grey skies, locks opening and closing, ports busy with loaders, cranes and workers who understood these ships not as legends but as tools that had schedules, routes, tonnage numbers, maintenance concerns, and captains who wanted weather reports that were accurate for once in human history. The cargo trade on the lakes was not glamorous, but it was essential. Iron ore came down from the Lake Superior region to feed the steel mills farther south. Whole industrial systems depended on vessels crossing that water over and over again. The ships were big because the loads were big. Efficiency mattered. Timing mattered. Weather mattered a great deal, and November mattered more than most months. The lakes in November are not casual lakes. By then the air has turned hard, the water is cold, and the seasonal temperature differences help build the kind of storm systems mariners talk about carefully. Wind over long stretches of open water has room to build serious seas, and once those waves get organised, life on a ship becomes much less about smooth progress and much more about angles, impacts, strain, and endurance. Decks go slick. Visibility drops. Equipment gets battered. A route that looks routine in calm conditions can become a long test of nerve and judgment in bad weather. This is important because when people first hear about the Edmund Fitzgerald, there can be a temptation to imagine a single dramatic cause. One monster wave, one loud crack, one obvious mistake, one movie-ready instant where everything turns at once. Real disasters are often much less generous than that. They develop through conditions, through accumulated forces, through pressure on metal, pressure on men, pressure on decisions. Sometimes the final event lasts seconds, but the setup has been building for hours, days, or even years. That is one reason this story keeps inviting fresh attention. It offers the shape of a mystery without always giving up a clean answer. The ship went down fast, but why exactly it went down fast has remained open to debate. People have proposed structural failure. Others have looked at flooding through damaged hatch covers. Some have focused on massive seas. Some on shoaling, meaning the vessel may have struck bottom or near bottom in dangerous conditions. There are arguments about loading, stress, weather interpretation, and the harsh mathematics of a huge ship meeting a huge lake at the wrong moment. Each theory has its advocates, each leaves certain questions behind, and because no one on board survived, there was no final first-hand explanation to pull everything together. That absence hangs over the whole story. Machines leave evidence, Wrecks leave evidence. Weather reports leave evidence. But a vanished crew leaves silence where memory should be. There were 29 men aboard. That number matters too, and it is easy to lose sight of it when a story becomes famous. Famous disasters often get flattened into symbols. A ship becomes the ship. A wreck becomes the mystery. A date becomes the event. But before all that, there are always ordinary people doing their jobs, eating meals, checking instruments, talking over the radio, noticing weather changes, carrying habits and private thoughts through another workday. On the Edmund Fitzgerald, those men were not stepping into a legend. They were sailing a well-known freighter on a commercial run, in weather that was bad and getting worse, which was serious enough on its own without the benefit of hindsight turning every small detail into an omen. Hindsight is very persuasive. It knows the ending. It points backward and says, "There, that was the sign." Real life does not work that way for the people inside it. They only have the moment they are in, the information they can gather, the judgment they trust, and whatever the lake decides to do next. You can see why this story fits the shape of a late-night historical mystery so well. It has a famous name, a hard landscape, a vanished giant, a set of final communications, and decades of people trying to reason their way into the last minutes of a ship that went down in deep, cold water. It also has one of those details that stays with you once you hear it. The Edmund Fitzgerald did not send a classic Mayday. There was no long radio drama announcing certain doom to the wider world. Instead, there were reports of difficulty, reports that the ship was holding its own, and then, suddenly, absence. That makes the whole event feel even more unsettling. A ship can be in trouble, a ship can be damaged, a ship can be fighting on. Then the line goes quiet. And quiet on dark water feels larger than ordinary silence. If you have ever stood near a big lake on a windy day, even for 10 minutes, you know something about that feeling. Not the danger itself, perhaps, not the stakes these men faced, but the way water and weather together can make human scale seem very small. The lake does not need to be angry in any human sense. It just has to keep being what it is, cold, deep and powerful. Wind moving across distance, waves building by the mile, steel meeting motion again and again and again. The Fitzgerald was built for that world, of course. Ships like it were not delicate. They were designed to carry huge cargoes through exactly these inland seas. That is what makes its loss feel so stubborn. This was not a vessel obviously out of its depth. It was a purpose-built giant with an experienced captain and crew. Which means that whatever happened on November 10th, 1975, happened inside the narrow and unforgiving zone where experience, engineering and determination were no longer enough. There is also something about cold weather shipwrecks that affects the imagination differently from tropical ones. No bright water, no coral, no cinematic blue horizon. Just dark swells, freezing spray, iron-grey sky, and a sense that every surface has become less negotiable than it was a few hours earlier. It is not a setting that flatters human confidence. You do not picture improvisation and heroic smiles. You picture numb hands, wet metal, instruments under strain, and the growing awareness that nature has stopped being a backdrop and started acting like the main condition of your existence. That may be one reason people return to this story at night. It feels serious in a way that does not depend on exaggeration. You do not have to decorate it. A very large ship entered bad weather on Lake Superior and disappeared with all hands. That sentence is already enough to quiet a room, but not enough to satisfy the mind. Because after the shock comes the next instinctive step. How? How does something that large vanish so quickly? What failed first? Was the storm the main cause, or only the final pressure on an already vulnerable vessel? Did the ship suffer damage earlier than anyone realised? Were the hatch covers compromised? Did the freighter strike something in the shoal area near Caribou Island? Did massive following seas overwhelm it? Did the hull break before it went under, or as it descended? Every answer seems to solve one piece and complicate another, and even before investigators, divers and analysts began sorting through those possibilities, there was the simpler human fact of the evening itself. Another ship nearby, the Arthur M. Anderson, was also battling the storm and keeping radio contact. The men aboard that vessel were among the last to hear from the Fitzgerald. Imagine that for a moment. You know the weather is rough. You know another ship is having trouble. You're all dealing with the same violent lake. Then contact stops. You look out into snow, darkness and high seas where a ship should be, and it is simply not there. No one who experiences that ever forgets it. We will spend time with all of that as we go on. The ship itself, the voyage, the men on board, the weather reports and the worsening storm, the final messages, the search, the wreck on the lakebed, the theories that have competed for decades, the details that seem to help, the details that seem to resist explanation, and throughout it, we're going to keep returning to the same central question, not because it has a neat answer ready to hand, but because this is one of those historical cases where looking closely matters more than pretending certainty where certainty does not exist. For now, it is enough to notice where the story begins to tighten. A giant freighter on Lake Superior, late in the shipping season, heavy cargo, experienced men, November weather turning rough then rougher, the kind of lake that does not make allowances, and a vessel with a reputation for size and strength, moving toward one of the most studied disappearances in freshwater maritime history. So before the wind rises any further, before the radios grow more urgent, before the shoreline falls away into dark water, and the whole account becomes a matter of timing, weather, steel, and unanswered seconds, let us stay a little longer with the ship herself, because to understand why the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald hit so hard, it helps to see what kind of vessel she was, how people talked about her, and why so many assumed that if any ship could manage the Great Lakes in a blow, this one could. To understand why the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald felt so large to so many people, you have to spend a little time with the ship before you ever put it in danger. You have to see it not as a wreck on the lakebed, not as a song title, not as a mystery waiting in dark water, but as a working giant in full daylight. Because that is how most people first knew it, not as a tragedy, as a presence. The Edmund Fitzgerald was the kind of ship people noticed even when they did not know very much about ships. It was built in 1957 and early 1958 by Great Lakes Engineering Works near Detroit, launched at River Rouge on June 7, 1958, and named for Edmund Fitzgerald, the president and chairman of Northwestern Mutual, the company that owned her. From the start, she was meant to be a major vessel in Great Lakes commerce, and when she entered service, she was the largest ship on the Great Lakes, measuring 729 feet long, 75 feet wide, and weighing 13,632 tons empty. That kind of size changes the way a vessel is seen. It is no longer just part of the traffic. It becomes something people point at from shore. And that was very much the reaction she got. For people along the lakes, the Fitzgerald was not some anonymous steel box doing anonymous industrial work. She had a personality in the public mind almost immediately. She was long, sleek by all boat standards, powerful, and modern enough to feel like a statement. The Street, Lawrence Seaway Array, had opened up new possibilities for Great Lakes shipping, and the Fitzgerald fit that moment perfectly. She had been designed right up near the maximum size, then practical for the Seaway system, which meant she represented a kind of engineering confidence. She said in steel that the lakes were not remote backwaters of commerce, but a serious transportation world with its own giants, its own routes, and its own floating monuments to scale and efficiency. It is also worth pausing over the fact that she did not come from a rough or forgotten corner of industry. This was not a last-minute bargain bin freighter assembled out of leftover optimism and bad paperwork. Northwestern Mutual had invested in her as part of a serious business venture, and Oglebay Norton, through its Columbia Transportation Division, operated her under long-term charter. She was a flagship vessel in every practical sense, and just as important, in the symbolic sense too. Companies like to have one piece of equipment that looks like it represents the whole enterprise at its best. A headquarters building can do that. A locomotive can do that. A ship can certainly do that, especially one this large. The Fitzgerald had that role. She was the sort of vessel that suggested reliability before anyone even checked the schedule. That helps explain the affectionate language around her. Sailors and lake watchers did not talk about her only in official dimensions and cargo figures. They gave her names: Big Fitz, Mighty Fitz, the pride of the American flag, as one National Weather Service historical summary puts it. Other retellings and memories use phrases like the pride of the American side. The precise wording shifts depending on who is telling the story, but the feeling stays the same. She was admired, she was familiar, she carried the kind of reputation that grows around a vessel when it becomes both a dependable machine and a local celebrity. There is something very human in that. Give people enough time around a large object that works hard and keeps showing up, and eventually they stop treating it like an object. It becomes she. It becomes there she is again. It becomes part of the scenery in a way that only moving things can. By ordinary standards, the Edmund Fitzgerald was a cargo carrier. By Great Lakes standards, it was a cargo carrier with a bit of swagger. Fully loaded, she could carry about 27,500 tons of cargo, driven by a 7,500 horsepower steam turbine engine that could push her to roughly 20 miles per hour. Her regular work was to move taconite iron ore pellets from the Lake Superior region, especially from ports tied to Minnesota's Iron Range, down towards steel mills in places like Detroit and Toledo. It was not glamorous cargo. Nobody writes love letters to taconite pellets. They are small, dense, practical, and very much part of the industrial bloodstream of the 20th century. But because the work was so essential, the ships that carried it became important in their own right. Every trip helped feed furnaces, mills, and factories far from the mine. You could say the Fitzgerald carried a dull-looking cargo and a very lively share of the region's economic muscle. And she did that work extremely well. In 1964, the Fitzgerald became the first carrier to haul more than 1 million tons of iron ore pellets through the Soo locks in a single season. That was not a decorative achievement. It was the kind of record that people inside shipping circles respected immediately, because it meant the ship was not merely impressive to look at. It performed, it hauled, it delivered. Later accounts of her career describe her as a record-setting workhorse, which is exactly the sort of phrase Great Lakes people tend to admire. Nobody on working water cares very much whether a vessel is fashionable. What matters is whether it can do the job again tomorrow and then again next week, and then 6 more times before the weather turns disagreeable. The Fitzgerald built that reputation year by year. It set seasonal haul records multiple times. It became one of those vessels whose size drew attention, but whose reliability kept it respected. There is something else that made the ship stand out, and it sounds almost funny if you're only picturing a rough bulk freighter covered in lake grime. By all boat standards, the Edmund Fitzgerald was unusually comfortable inside. Contemporary and later descriptions note that it had more polished accommodations than many working freighters of its class, with passenger staterooms, air-conditioned crew quarters, and well-furnished interior spaces. That detail matters because it tells you what sort of vessel owners and operators believed they had. This was not just a steel trough for moving rocks from one place to another. It was a top-tier freighter built to impress guests, treat senior visitors well, and reflect nicely on the company whose name, quite literally, it carried. If a typical workboat is a lunch pail, the Fitzgerald was a lunch pail with a good suit jacket hanging beside it. Still a worker, just one expected to be seen. Now, none of this means the Fitzgerald lived some spotless, trouble-free life before 1975. Ships that work hard for years collect incidents the way trucks collect dents, and train depots collect old stories. The Detroit Historical Society notes several notable mishaps in the ship's career. In September 1969, she ran aground near the Soo locks, causing damage. In 1970, she collided with another vessel and later hit a lock wall. In 1974, she lost her bow anchor in the Detroit River near Belle Isle. That anchor was eventually recovered and is now displayed in Detroit. These events are important not because they prove some dramatic doom was hanging over the ship from the beginning, but because they remind us that the Fitzgerald was a real working vessel in a demanding environment. She was not preserved in glass. She was out there year after year, taking the ordinary punishment of commercial service on the lakes. Still, ships age through impact, strain, repairs, maintenance, and repetition. That is normal. The only reason these earlier incidents draw special attention now is that everything before a disaster gets examined more closely after one happens. You can see how easy it would have been, though, for people around the lakes to feel that this ship was somehow above ordinary vulnerability. Not invincible exactly, because sailors tend to be too practical for that sort of nonsense, but dependable in a way that bordered on reassuring. It was large, it was proven, it had an experienced reputation, it had the kind of name people remembered. If another ore carrier passed in the distance, maybe you nodded and got on with your day. If the Fitzgerald passed, maybe you watched a little longer. Maybe you pointed it out to someone nearby. Maybe children along the shore looked at it the way children look at any machine so oversized that it seems to belong to a special category of reality. There is a simple awe in seeing something that big move so steadily. A ship that size does not seem to glide. It seems to proceed with authority. That authority had a social life of its own. There were people who made a point of watching for the Fitzgerald. There were ports where its arrival was a familiar event. There were mariners who considered time aboard her a privilege. The National Weather Service historical background on the ship says exactly that. Sailors considered themselves privileged to serve aboard her. That one line says a great deal. Working on a ship is not a school field trip. It is labour, routine, discipline, weather, machinery, and long familiarity with the moods of water. If experienced sailors were pleased to be assigned to this vessel, it means the Fitzgerald had earned something more than public admiration. It had professional respect. Among mariners, that matters more. The public may be impressed by size, but crews care about how a ship behaves. A good reputation on the inside is harder to fake. It also helps explain why the later loss felt personal to so many communities around the lakes. A nameless vessel can disappear into a statistics table. The Edmund Fitzgerald could not. Too many people already knew it. They knew the outline of its hull. They knew the route it often took. They knew the stories attached to it. By the mid-1970s, it had spent 17 seasons hauling taconite and setting records. That is enough time for a working ship to become part of a region's memory while it is still alive and functioning. In a sense, the Fitzgerald achieved the odd status some machines acquire when they are both common and special. It was common enough to be part of ordinary Great Lakes life, special enough to be remembered each time it appeared, and because this was a ship on the Great Lakes, not out on some remote ocean crossing, there was an extra closeness to it. People lived with these freighters in their field of vision. They saw them under bridges, in rivers, near locks, in harbours, against city skylines, beside grain elevators, under low cloud, and in summer haze. These ships were not distant abstractions of global trade. They were local giants. They passed through daily landscapes. If you grew up near the lakes, a vessel like the Fitzgerald was not just part of industry. It was part of what home looked like. That is one reason the ship's size still matters so much in the retelling. You will often hear the dimensions repeated almost like a ritual. 729 feet, 75 feet wide, largest on the lakes when launched. Those numbers survive because they help people feel the shock all over again. A fishing boat can disappear and people understand it immediately, because small things vanish all the time in bad weather. But a freighter that had once held the title of the largest ship on the Great Lakes is different. The mind resists it. It keeps wanting to say, yes, but surely not that one. There is a temptation, when telling stories like this, to make the ship itself sound too noble, too grand, too wrapped in legend before the facts have earned it. That is not necessary here. The plain details are enough. The Edmund Fitzgerald was a major ore carrier built at the high end of Great Lakes design for its time. It was launched to attention, worked hard for years, built an excellent reputation, hauled immense loads of taconite, and became familiar far beyond the usual audience for commercial shipping. There is nothing exaggerated about saying people admired it. They did. There is nothing sentimental about saying it mattered on the lakes before it ever sank. It did. Sometimes the plainest version is the strongest one, and there is one more detail that quietly sharpens the picture. The Fitzgerald was not lost on its first rough outing, not during some reckless proving run, not in an era when Great Lakes shipping was still improvising its basic methods. By 1975, this was a seasoned vessel in a mature system, run by people who knew their work. That makes the ship's reputation even more important, because it tells us what kind of confidence surrounded it going into that final season. This was not a fragile newcomer. It was a known quantity. A giant, yes, but a familiar giant. So when November came around in 1975, and the Fitzgerald loaded taconite at Superior, Wisconsin, bound for the Detroit area, nobody on shore would have looked at that departure and thought they were watching a legend move toward its ending. They would have seen what they had seen many times before. A big, capable lake freighter doing the job it was built to do, heading out into a season that was always demanding, on water that never liked overconfidence, with 29 men aboard and another run underway. And that is where the story tightens a little more. Because once you know what sort of ship this was, once you understand why people trusted it, and why crews were proud to serve on it, the next part becomes heavier. Now, the giant has a shape. Now it has a history. Now it has weight in the mind. Which means that when it leaves port and starts north and east into the cold, open reach of Lake Superior in early November, you can feel what everyone else still could not. That the vessel people admired as one of the great working ships of the lakes was already moving toward weather that would ask far more of it than any nickname ever could. By the time the Edmund Fitzgerald left Superior on the afternoon of November 9th, 1975, there was nothing about the moment that would have looked extraordinary to anyone standing on shore. The ship had loaded at Burlington Northern Railroad Dock No. 1 in Superior, Wisconsin. It was carrying 26,116 long tons of taconite pellets, bound for Zug Island near Detroit, and it departed at about 2:15 in the afternoon, under the command of Captain Ernest M. McSorley. On paper, this was a familiar job. Or up top, mills down below, one more run through cold season water on a route the ship and its people understood very well. That ordinary quality matters. It is one of the details that gives this story its strange weight. People like a dramatic beginning because it makes the ending feel somehow prepared. A crack of thunder, a warning no one listens to, a man on the dock saying he has a bad feeling. History is usually less theatrical than that. Most tragedies begin inside routine. Men go to work, cargo is loaded, lines are cast off, engines answer, the ship moves. That was the shape of this departure. The Fitzgerald had been doing exactly this kind of work for years, carrying iron ore products from the Lake Superior region to lower lake ports. There was no reason for the ship herself to look like a question mark. She looked like what she had always looked like. A big, capable freighter heading out to do a very practical job, and the practical side of Great Lakes shipping can make these departures seem almost plain until you sit with them. There is no tropical colour to distract you, no glamorous passenger deck, no orchestra polishing its final notes. Bulk freighters leave working docks with cargo that exist almost entirely to become something else later. Taconite pellets are not the sort of thing that inspire postcards. They are processed iron ore, small and dense, made to be loaded in huge quantities and moved efficiently to steel-making centres. That was the Fitzgerald's world. Iron, schedules, weather, fuel, distance, and the professional habits of men who knew the lake season was getting late. Still, late-season work on the Great Lakes carried its own atmosphere, and November had a reputation no captain needed explained twice. The shipping season did not end just because the air had become less friendly. Freight still had to move. Time still mattered. But everybody in that business understood that November on Lake Superior was not the same thing as July on Lake Superior wearing a heavier coat. By early November, the water was cold, the air systems crossing the region were stronger, and the storm tracks could produce long, ugly stretches of wind and building seas. The National Weather Service describes the storm of November 9th and 10th, 1975, as a strong autumn system that organised in the central United States on November 9th, moved northeast, and deepened significantly as it headed toward upper Michigan. Early that morning, the low was around 1,000 millibars over central Kansas. By the evening of November 9th, it had strengthened to about 993 millibars over eastern Iowa. And by the morning of November 10th, it was near Marquette at about 982 millibars, continuing to intensify as it crossed the region. Now, that sounds serious when you already know the ending, and it was serious, but it did not begin as a uniquely impossible forecast. One of the difficulties in telling this story is that hindsight makes every weather map look like a written warning. Captains in real time do not get hindsight. They get forecasts, updates, observations, and their own judgment. The weather expected at first was bad in a familiar November way, not apocalyptic in a storybook way. According to later summaries of the voyage, Captain McSorley and Captain Jesse Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson knew a storm was entering the Great Lakes from the plains, and chose a more northerly course across Superior, closer to the shelter of the Canadian shore and the higher terrain there. That decision in itself tells you something useful. They were not oblivious. They were navigating with weather in mind from the start. Around 5 in the afternoon, the Fitzgerald was joined in company by the Arthur M. Anderson, another ore carrier under Captain Cooper. The Anderson had departed from Two Harbors, Minnesota, with a similar cargo bound for Gary, Indiana. The Fitzgerald was the faster ship, so it took the lead, with the two vessels maintaining radio contact and generally travelling with several miles between them. Later reports describe the distance as ranging roughly from 10 to 15 miles, or, at some points in official reporting, about 10 to 20 miles. In practical terms, they were near enough to share information and far enough apart that each still had its own fight with the lake. It is easy to imagine that arrangement as reassuring, and in some ways it was. Another ship nearby means another experienced captain observing the same weather system, another crew able to compare notes, another set of eyes in a hard place. But there is also something lonely about two ships on a large lake in worsening weather. They are companions in the broadest sense, not neighbours in the comforting sense. Radio contact is useful. So is shared strategy. Yet each ship still rises and falls on its own hull, in its own timing, under its own strain. Water is very good at keeping human beings separate, even when they are trying to stay together. As the Fitzgerald headed out from Superior and into the open reach of Lake Superior, the geography mattered more than casual listeners might expect. This is not a small lake where you can think in terms of hugging a shoreline and being done with it. Superior is vast. It gives weather room to organise and waves room to build. The route the Fitzgerald and Anderson chose took them between Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula, making use of the northern part of the lake before eventually turning southeast toward Whitefish Bay and the relative shelter near a Whitefish Point. It was the kind of route a sensible master might choose when trying to reduce exposure to the worst conditions by using the land as partial protection where possible. You can hear the judgment in that choice, not bravado, not a charge into open water for the sake of proving anything, just practical seamanship on a practical voyage. That practicality is important because people sometimes talk about weather disasters as though the victim stepped into them carelessly. The record here does not support that kind of lazy storytelling. These were Great Lakes professionals. McSorley was not a romantic amateur in a borrowed cap trying to impress the weather with his confidence. He was an experienced master mariner. The Fitzgerald herself was a seasoned ore carrier. The decision-making on the voyage reflects people trying to manage worsening conditions, not ignore them. That does not make them magically safe, of course. It just restores some realism to the scene. The lake was not dangerous because the men aboard were foolish. It was dangerous because Lake Superior in November is entirely capable of overwhelming good judgment along with bad. If you slow the moment down enough, you can almost feel the shift from routine departure into the first real seriousness of the run. At the dock, everything is still made of procedure. After departure, the ship finds its rhythm. Engines settle into their work. The cargo sits heavy in the holds. Men move through their stations, through meals, through checks, through the ordinary business of being at sea without calling it that, because on the Great Lakes people often say, "on the lakes," and keep their tone practical. Outside, though, the scale begins to assert itself. The open water is longer than it looks on a map. The daylight in November does not linger in a generous way. Wind over distance begins to organise itself. A deck that was simply cold becomes wet and unpleasant. The first uneasy motions of the hull become more constant. None of that means disaster. It just means the voyage is no longer sitting in harbour under human terms. It belongs to the lake now. For a while, this would still have felt manageable. The Fitzgerald soon reached roughly her full speed after departure, and there would have been every reason to make steady progress while conditions allowed it. A ship like this is not casual about time. Delays ripple outward into loading schedules, deliveries, dock planning, and the larger industrial system waiting at the other end. That does not mean captains ignore danger for the sake of punctuality. It means there is always a balance between caution and continuation, and experienced mariners are constantly making that balance in their heads. How bad is the weather now? How bad is it likely to become? What shelter is available? What route reduces risk? How much strain is acceptable? These are not dramatic questions in the moment. They are ordinary ones, repeated across working water for generations. The trouble with ordinary professional questions is that history usually only remembers them when the answers turn out not to be enough. By evening on November 9th, gale warnings had been issued, and by early on November 10th, those warnings had been upgraded to storm warnings. The weather kept building. NOAA's historical summary of the storm notes that before the low crossed Lake Superior, ship observations reported sustained winds of roughly 30 to 45 knots from the northeast, east, or southeast. As the system crossed the lake, winds shifted to the northwest and increased, with 50-knot winds recorded over the eastern part of the lake. Ship observations also indicated waves of around 16 to 18 feet during the height of the storm, and NOAA adds that peak waves could have been 1.5 to 2 times that height. Those are serious conditions for any vessel, and for a long bulk carrier they mean repeated heavy motion, pounding, spray, stress, and a deck environment that is no longer forgiving. It is tempting to imagine those numbers in a nice controlled way, because numbers on a page are very obedient. 16 feet, 18 feet, 50 knots. But life on a ship does not experience weather as neat figures. It experiences weather as sound, impact, timing, and motion. It is one thing to read that waves were in the mid-teens with possible larger peaks. It is another to stand on a vessel and feel the sequence of them. Up, down, strike, shudder, spray, wind. Another rise, another sea, another long minute. The lake does not hit once for emphasis, and then politely leave the scene. It works by repetition. Repetition wears on steel. Repetition wears on fittings. Repetition wears on confidence. Repetition turns discomfort into concern, and concern into the kind of concentration that narrows every conversation on board. And yet there is something else to remember here. The Fitzgerald was built for hard work, and the men aboard it were not new to rough weather, so the early part of this voyage would not have been narrated inside their heads as the beginning of a famous mystery. It would have been narrated, if at all in practical terms, this is building. We will take the northern route, stay in contact, keep an eye on it, watch the forecasts, adjust as needed. There is no evidence of panic in the departure or in the early management of the run. The story only becomes eerie because we know where it goes. For the men on board, the voyage began as another hard weather passage in a hard weather season, serious but still within the world of work. That is one of the saddest parts of the whole case. Disaster was not announced to them as disaster. It arrived in steps that still looked, for a while, like something professional sailors could ride through. You can also feel the lake changing around them, in the way the route itself becomes less like a line on a chart and more like a series of hoped-for advantages. Shelter matters. Relative shelter matters even more. A stretch under a certain shoreline can mean lower seas, or a better angle to the wind for a time. Then the ship moves on, the geography changes, and the protection falls away. The decision for the Fitzgerald and the Anderson to take the northerly course reflected exactly that kind of thinking. Stay where the Canadian Highlands may help, cross between Isle Royale and the Quinault, then later turn southeast for Whitefish Bay. In calm weather, that route is just a route. In a November storm, it becomes an argument with the lake made one heading at a time. Meanwhile, darkness would have come in with the particular efficiency that Northern November manages so well. That matters more than people think. Bad weather in daylight is one thing. Bad weather after dark is a different kind of mental burden. Distance changes. Horizon disappears. What you know of the lake is increasingly mediated by radar, instruments, light, radio, memory and feel. The ship itself becomes a small world of metal, lighting, routine, and movement, surrounded by black water and weather you can hear even when you cannot see its full shape. Anyone who has spent time around open water at night knows that darkness does not merely remove sight. It changes proportion. Sounds get larger, space feels less negotiable. Somewhere inside that darkness, the Fitzgerald kept pushing eastward with its cargo, and the Anderson followed, keeping contact. At this stage, the important thing is not yet a single dramatic event, but the steady loss of comfort. Weather continuing to worsen. Warnings elevated. Open water turning meaner. Two large freighters trying to make practical decisions inside a system that was becoming less practical by the hour. This is where a lot of shipwreck stories actually live, not at the final plunge but in the long approach, when choices are still being made and the full price of the weather has not yet been collected. There is a reason people who know the lake speak about November with a certain plain seriousness. The month has a reputation not because every voyage ends badly, but because the gap between manageable and unmanageable can shrink quickly. A ship can still be making way. A captain can still be thinking clearly. The route can still make sense, and the conditions can still move, almost step by step towards something much harsher than the earlier forecast suggested. That was happening now. The storm was deepening. Winds were strengthening. The eastern part of Lake Superior would see some of the worst conditions, and the Fitzgerald, heading toward Whitefish Bay, was moving deeper into the same broad system that was tightening its grip across the lake. So this voyage into cold, open water was not reckless, and it was not casual. It began like a working run, then gradually became a weather run, and then began edging towards something more severe than that. Cargo still sat in the holds. The ship still had its companion nearby. The destination still existed on the chart. But the balance had started to shift. The lake was taking up more space in every decision. The atmosphere was moving from inconvenience to threat. And a passage that would have sounded ordinary at the dock was becoming, hour by hour, a test of how much a giant freighter and an experienced crew could absorb before the storm stopped being something to navigate around and started becoming the main fact of the night. Which is why, once the Fitzgerald was fully committed to the crossing and the weather continued to build, the next thing that mattered more than cargo, schedule, or reputation was the same thing that has mattered to sailors for as long as ships have gone out into bad water at all. What exactly the weather intended to do next. When people first learn this story, the crew can accidentally turn into a number. 29 men. It is a true number, of course, and a terrible one, but numbers have a way of flattening the people inside them. They can make a shipwreck sound neat on paper, when there was nothing neat about it at all. The Edmund Fitzgerald did not carry 29 identical shadows. It carried a captain, mates, engineers, oilers, wheelsmen, deckhands, watchmen, cooks, porters, a steward, a cadet, and maintenance men. The National Transportation Safety Board described the crew as one master, 3 licensed deck officers, a chief engineer, 4 licensed engineering officers, and 20 unlicensed personnel. It also noted that no survivors were found and no bodies were recovered. That official description is useful, but it's still very tidy. Real crews are not tidy. They are mixtures of age, habit, skill, mood, routine, and long familiarity. On a freighter, everybody's job is specific, and yet everybody's life spills past the job title in 100 ordinary ways. The man steering the ship is also somebody's father. The man working in the engine room has favourite foods, old stories, and a hometown where people know exactly how he laughs. The cook is not just galley personnel. He is the person who makes sure a steel ship full of tired men can sit down to hot food in bad weather, which is one of those jobs that sounds simple until you imagine trying to carry soup across a moving floor. The officers on the Fitzgerald were not inexperienced men improvising their way through a difficult profession. The NTSB stated that Captain Ernest M. McSorley and Chief Mate John McCarthy were experienced Great Lakes mariners, with the captain licensed since 1938 and McCarthy since 1941. McSorley had worked for the vessel's operator since 1938, had served as master since 1951, and had been master of the Fitzgerald since April 1972. The NTSB also said the chief mate had been with the operator since 1947 and had served aboard the Fitzgerald as chief mate since April 1975. McSorley himself was 63 years old on that last voyage, born on September 29, 1912. John McCarthy, the first mate, had been born on July 14, 1913. Those dates matter because they place both men in the category of long-water veterans. They had spent decades around ships, decades around the habits and demands of Great Lakes commerce, decades learning what different weather meant in practice rather than in theory. These were not men who looked at November and thought, with youthful confidence, that the lake was merely being theatrical. They knew what it could do, and yet the Fitzgerald was not crewed only by older hands. That is part of what makes the roster feel so human when you linger over it. Carl A. Peckle, the watchman, had been born on September 6, 1955. Mark A. Thomas, a deckhand, had been born on August 14, 1954. David E. Weiss, the cadet, had been born on November 13, 1953. In other words, while the ship carried men who had spent a lifetime on the lakes, it also carried young men in their early 20s, still near the beginning of adult life, still close enough to boyhood that people back home would almost certainly have said things like, "He's still just a kid," even while he was out there earning a living on one of the biggest freighters on the lakes. That spread in age changes the emotional shape of the crew. It means the Fitzgerald held more than one generation at once. There were men near retirement and men just starting out. Robert C. Rafferty, the steward and cook, had been born in 1913. John D. Simmons, one of the wheelsmen, had also been born in 1913. Ralph G. Walton, an oiler, was born in 1917. Across the same decks and passageways moved younger men like Peckle, Thomas, and Weiss. A ship like that is not just a workplace. It is a temporary little society with elders, apprentices, specialists, and people in between. If you only hear the job titles, the arrangement can sound mechanical. It was anything but. The bridge needed licensed officers and wheelsmen. The engine spaces needed engineers, oilers, and a wiper. The galley and stewards department kept men fed, and the ship functioning as a livable place instead of a floating iron headache. Watchmen and deckhands handled work that was repetitive, physical, and essential. A cadet learned by doing. Maintenance men kept after the endless business of wear, fittings, equipment, and things that start as minor annoyances and become major problems if ignored. On a freighter, there is no such thing as a decorative crew member. Everybody is there because the ship needs him. You can start to see the ship as a living place once you put a few of those men back into view. Captain Ernest M. McSorley was from Toledo, Ohio, at least in the records of the memorial site that tracks the crew. John McCarthy, the first mate, was from Bay Village, Ohio. James A. Pratt, the second mate, was from Lakewood, Ohio. Michael E. Armagost, the third mate, came from Iron River, Wisconsin. George J. Holl, the chief engineer, came from Cabot, Pennsylvania. Edward F. Binden, first assistant engineer, was from Fairport Harbor, Ohio, and Thomas E. Edwards, second assistant engineer, from Oregon, Ohio. Even that partial list gives you the feel of Great Lakes labour in the mid-20th century. Ohio strongly represented, Wisconsin present, one man from Pennsylvania, and the ship itself drawing talent from towns where the lakes, rivers, and industrial corridors shaped whole working lives. Then there were the men whose jobs kept the vessel physically alive below the public story. Blaine H. Wilhelm, one of the oilers, was from Moqua, Wisconsin. Ralph Walton, another oiler, was from Fremont, Ohio. Gordon F. McClellan, the wiper, was from Clearwater, Florida. Those titles do not sound glamorous, but engine room work on a big steam-powered freighter was serious, hot, dirty labour, the kind done by men who knew machinery well enough to trust it and distrust it at the same time. Blaine's daughter later recalled that on the Fitzgerald he worked in the engine room and that he had been sailing as long as she could remember. The wheelsmen give you another angle on the crew. Eugene W. O'Brien, John D. Simmons, and John J. Poviash all served as wheelsmen. Eugene was from Toledo, Simmons from Ashland, Wisconsin, and Poviash from Bradenton, Florida. John O'Brien, Eugene's son, later described his father's work in plain terms, steering and helping navigate, with the captain never far away. That sort of comment is helpful because it reminds you that wheelsman is not just an old maritime word that sounds nice in a documentary. It meant hours of concentration, response to orders, and practical control of a giant vessel under changing conditions. And because a ship is still a human place even in bad weather, there were the men who kept it fed and ordered. Robert Rafferty, the steward and cook, had attended baking and cooking classes during the off-season, according to his memorial page, and his daughter later remembered being glad when he was home in winter because the family got to eat his class homework. Alan G. Kalman served as second cook. Nolan F. Church was a porter. That may sound almost domestic beside the drama of a storm, but ships run on meals, clean spaces, coffee routine, and all the forms of order people miss only when they break down. Even legends need dinner. Some of the crew biographies are brief, and that brevity has its own sadness. Carl Peckles' page tells you he was born in 1955, came from Ashtabula, Ohio, and served as a watchman. Mark Thomas's page tells you he was born in 1954, came from Richmond Heights, Ohio, and worked as a deckhand. David Weiss's page tells you he was born in 1953, came from Agoura, California, and served as the cadet. 3 young men, 3 simple records, and behind each a whole unwritten quantity of plans, habits, friends, and assumptions about how much life remained. Others leave slightly fuller traces. Gordon McClellan had worked on the Fitzgerald for 5 years as a wiper and had gone to school to become a pastry chef. He had also just built an A-frame home in Presque Isle and had spent less than a month in it before taking that final voyage. Joseph W. Mazes, the special maintenance man from Ashland, Wisconsin, had sailed the Great Lakes for 30 years, and family memories say the 1975 season was supposed to be his last before retirement. Those are the details that quietly change a disaster. A home just built. A retirement almost reached. History likes dramatic endings, but real grief often lives in interrupted ordinary things. Ransom E. Cundy, one of the watchmen, carried an especially striking biography. His memorial page says he was born in 1922, fought with the US Marine Corps at Iwo Jima in 1945, survived that historic battle, received several medals and commendations, and then went on to a long career sailing for different companies before joining Ogle Bay Norton. His daughter Cheryl later remembered him not in military terms, but as a father who made homemade French fries and breakfast, liked practical jokes, took over dishwashing when he was home, and loved his family deeply. That contrast tells you almost everything useful about why crew lists matter. One man can be a veteran of one of the most brutal battles of the Second World War and still be remembered most vividly by his child for potatoes, teasing and walks. Blaine Wilhelm's family memory has the same effect. His daughter Heidi remembered summers at the lake, barbecue, picking blueberries, and her father saving change all year and splitting it among the kids when he came home. His biographical page says he had 7 children. Again, the job title alone, oiler, does not tell you much. The family memory tells you more. It tells you this was a man who returned from the ships with pockets full of coins and enough affection to turn that small ritual into something his children never forgot. John Simmons survives in memory that way too. His granddaughter remembered walking with him to the corner store for soda pop and hearing the change jingle in his pocket. Eugene O'Brien's son remembered a cheerful, sociable father who liked cards, laughed easily, and took him on annual trips. Gordon McClellan's relatives remembered him as short, stocky, smiling, and fond of hot dogs. There is almost something defiant in those memories. Disaster wants to simplify people. Families keep putting the small details back. The jingling coins, the hot dogs, the card games, the easy smile. That is why I think this part of the story matters so much. The loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald is often told at the level of weather and steel, and of course it has to be. Storms, hull stress, flooding, radar trouble, cargo, wave height, route decisions, all of that belongs in the account. But if you stay only at that level, the crew become passengers in their own story. They were not. They were the story's human centre. They were the reason the ship's disappearance did not become merely an engineering problem. 29 jobs were lost, yes, but also 29 daily presences. 29 distinct ways of being in a room. 29 places at family tables that did not fill again. And there is another thing to say, because it keeps coming up when people who love the crew talk about them. Cheryl Rosmond, daughter of Ransom Cundy, said in an interview that she believed Captain McSorley had hand-picked the Fitzgerald's crew when he was assigned to the vessel, and that her father knew the ship thoroughly and would have helped anyone who needed help doing the work. That is a family recollection, not a formal investigative finding, but it fits the broader official record that the officers were experienced and the crew seasoned. It also gives you a sense of the ship as a place of trust and familiarity, rather than a random collection of names. So when the Fitzgerald headed out on November 9th, what left the dock was not just a famous freighter with a cargo of taconite, it was a community in miniature. A 63-year-old captain with decades on the lakes, veteran mates and engineers, men in their 50s and 60s who had built whole lives around Great Lakes shipping. Younger men in their early 20s learning their way inside that world. A cadet, a cook who took classes in the off-season, a former Marine who had already survived one great violence, a father who saved his pocket change for his children, a smiling wiper who liked hot dogs, a maintenance man almost close enough to retirement to taste it. Once you know that, the voyage changes shape in the mind. The ship is no longer only a vessel, it becomes a place filled with recognisable lives. You can picture coffee in mugs, work gloves, boots drying, engine room heat, conversation in the galley, men rotating through watches, men who have done this for years, men still new enough to be watched by the older ones, all of them moving through the routines that make a ship function. And that in turn makes the coming weather feel heavier, because now when the lake begins to turn harder and the radios grow more serious, it is not only steel entering danger, it is this whole small society, with all its habits and histories moving step by step into a storm that has not yet finished showing them what it intends to be. By the morning of November 10th, the voyage had changed its character. The day before, the Edmund Fitzgerald had left Superior as a working freighter on a familiar run. Now it was a very large ship in a storm that was still growing. That is an important distinction. Storms are often remembered as if they arrive all at once, fully formed, like a door being kicked open. On the lakes, they often do something more difficult. They build in stages. They give you weather, then worse weather, then weather that starts pushing against the limits of comfort, and then weather that begins testing equipment, timing, and judgment at the same time. During the night of November 9th into November 10th, the low-pressure system moving through the region intensified rapidly, going from about 993 millibars over eastern Iowa on the evening of the 9th to about 982 millibars over Marquette by the morning of the 10th, before continuing northeast across Lake Superior. That matters because a deepening storm does not simply make the lake rougher in a general way. It changes wind direction, wave growth, pressure, visibility, and the simple question of what kind of trouble a ship is likely to meet next. Before the low crossed the lake, ship observations showed sustained winds of about 30 to 45 knots from the northeast, east, or southeast. As the low crossed Lake Superior, the winds shifted to the northwest and strengthened further, with 50-knot winds recorded over the eastern part of the lake. Observed waves during the height of the storm were around 16 to 18 feet, and the National Weather Service notes that peak waves could have been 1.5 to 2 times higher than that. In other words, this was already hard weather, and the most violent individual seas may have been much larger than the average figures suggest. That shift from ordinary bad weather to something more punishing can be hard to picture from the comfort of land, so it helps to slow it down. A captain does not experience 30 to 45 knots from the northeast as a tidy row of numbers. He experiences it as a ship taking repeated force at a particular angle, as timing between seas, as water coming where it should not, as spray, noise, and the changing feel of the hull underfoot. Then, as the storm centre moves and the wind shifts around, the whole pattern changes. The same lake that had been pushing one way starts pushing another way. The old rhythm goes away. A ship that had found a tolerable angle suddenly meets a less tolerable one. On a long bulk carrier like the Fitzgerald, that is not a minor inconvenience. It affects motion, deck impact, steering response, and strain along the vessel's length. The official weather warnings were changing too. Gale warnings had been issued on the evening of November 9th. Around 2 a.m. on November 10th, the National Weather Service upgraded that to a storm warning, forecasting winds of roughly 35 to 50 knots and waves in the 8 to 15 foot range for eastern Lake Superior, with a later shift in wind direction as the system moved through. That wording can sound almost modest when you compare it to what later ship observations and reanalysis suggested, but the change from gale warning to storm warning tells you how the night was trending. Mariners do not hear storm warning as decorative language. They hear it as the moment the forecast has crossed into a category that demands more attention, less comfort, and fewer assumptions. Somewhere inside that worsening night, the Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson were still doing what working freighters do. They were pushing on. The faster Fitzgerald pulled ahead during the early morning hours, while the Anderson continued behind in company. The NTSB report notes that the Fitzgerald made routine weather reports at 1 a.m. and 7 a.m. on November the 10th, and in the normal morning report to the company office stated that its estimated arrival at Sault-Ste-Marie was indefinite because of bad weather. That line is easy to pass over, but it's one of the clearest signs that the weather had moved from inconvenience into serious operational fact. A timetable had become uncertain. The ship was still functioning, still reporting, still making decisions in an orderly way, but the lake had made itself the main variable. It is worth noticing the tone of that stage of the voyage. There is no evidence of panic in those early hours, no dramatic signal to the wider world that a catastrophe was underway. The ship was not speaking like a doomed vessel. It was speaking like a working vessel in worsening weather. That distinction matters. It reminds us that on board this was still being treated as a hard weather passage, not an unfolding legend. The captain and crew had no reason at dawn to narrate their own day as the last day of the ship. They had every reason to narrate it as a difficult November run on Lake Superior. That is how disasters often look from inside. They do not identify themselves at first. They simply demand more and more from the people involved. The route the Fitzgerald and the Anderson had chosen now began to show both its wisdom and its limits. They had agreed to take the more northerly course across Superior, using the Canadian shore and its higher ground for as much shelter as possible, before eventually turning southeast toward Whitefish Bay. That was careful seamanship, not bravado. But shelter on a lake that size is always relative. A shoreline can help for a while. Geography can improve your angle for a stretch. Then the route changes, the land falls away, and the storm has fresh room to work on you again. There is no magical safe lane on Superior when a November system has decided to strengthen. There are only degrees of exposure, and they keep changing with position and wind. By the time the ships were moving east across the lake on November 10th, visibility and surface conditions were deteriorating further. Later historical summaries note that in the early afternoon the Fitzgerald had passed Mihipicotton Island and was approaching Caribou Island, while the Anderson was farther back near Mihipicotton. Snow and rising spray had already obscured the Fitzgerald from direct sight and left it visible only on radar, roughly 17 miles ahead. This is another point where weather stops being background and starts getting into every practical part of the voyage. When sight goes, distance becomes more abstract. When spray rises and snow thickens, radar gets more work and also more interference. Sea return begins cluttering the screen. Every estimate of position and movement becomes more dependent on instruments, communication, and experience. That loss of clean visibility has a psychological effect too. In daylight and fair conditions, another ship is a presence. You can look at it, track it, judge its motion against the horizon. In snow squalls and rising spray, another ship becomes a blip, then a fading return, then something you know is out there but cannot comfortably verify with your eyes. On a quiet afternoon, this would merely be annoying. In a building storm, it increases the sense that the lake is taking pieces of the world away one by one. First, the easy horizon, then the other ship, then the confidence that what you cannot see is still behaving normally. None of that proves disaster. It just makes every later development more serious, because now the crew is dealing not only with water and wind, but with less certainty about what lies immediately around them. There is another detail from that afternoon that has stayed in the story, because it sits right at the border between weather and physical damage. Captain Cooper of the Anderson later maintained that he watched the Fitzgerald pass very close to 6 Fathom Shoal north of Caribou Island, seeing on radar what he believed was the vessel crossing a dangerous shallow water area. That observation later became important in some sinking theories, but even without stepping into those debates yet, it belongs in this part of the story because it shows how tightly navigation, visibility, weather, and risk had begun to press together. A route that may have looked manageable on paper was now being sailed in a storm, with snow, spray, and heavy seas, reducing margin for error and making every navigational choice more consequential. By mid-afternoon, the first clear signs of damage were appearing. At about 3:30 p.m, Captain McSorley radioed Captain Cooper and reported that he had a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. He also said he was checking down his speed and asked the Anderson to stay by him until he could get to Whitefish. Cooper asked whether the pumps were running and McSorley said both were. Even told plainly, that is a serious report. A list means the ship is leaning. Lost or damaged vents mean openings on deck structures have been compromised. A fence rail coming down is not by itself a fatal issue, but it tells you the weather has become physical enough to tear things away. Most of all, the request for the Anderson to stay by says something had shifted. This was no longer just 2 freighters sharing weather information. One of them was now asking the other for company in the practical mariner's sense of that word. That is the point where the weather had truly turned. Not merely because the forecast had been upgraded, and not merely because the wind had strengthened, but because the storm had begun reaching into the ship's condition. It had become damage. It had become list. It had become pumps running. It had become speed being checked down. This is how bad weather advances in a real case. It does not remain a dramatic backdrop for very long. It begins taking pieces, a vent, a rail, visibility, speed, options. It takes them one at a time, and only later do people on land compress those hours into a single sentence about a storm. At the same time, the storm itself was still escalating in the eastern part of the lake. A later National Weather Service re-examination, based on mesoscale modelling published in 2006, concluded that the worst conditions were coincident with the time and location at which the Fitzgerald was lost. That work found sustained winds near storm force, around 48 knots, and significant waves of more than 25 feet near the loss area around 7 p.m. This does not replace the ship observations from the day, but it does help explain why the weather in the Fitzgerald's final hours may have been even more punishing and more locally severe than older summaries alone suggested. In simple terms, the ship was not merely in a big storm somewhere on Lake Superior. It appears to have reached one of the worst parts of the lake at one of the worst moments of that storm. That sort of finding matters because it pushes back against the neat idea that this was just a standard rough weather run that went slightly wrong. The broader storm may not have been unique by November standards, as the National Weather Service notes, but the specific overlap of place and timing appears to have been brutal. On a large lake, local conditions matter enormously. The difference between rough everywhere and worst right where you are is not academic. It is the difference between a ship enduring punishment and a ship beginning to exhaust its margin for survival. There is something very cold in that realization. The route, the timing, the wind shift, the wave field, the visibility, all of it was stacking up in one place around one vessel that was already beginning to report damage. Meanwhile, the Anderson was getting its own proof of how violent the lake had become. As the afternoon wore on, Captain Cooper later reported winds from the northwest by west at a steady 58 knots with gusts to 70 and seas of 18 to 25 feet. At about 5:20 p.m, the crest of a wave smashed the Anderson's starboard lifeboat, rendering it unusable. That detail is not only dramatic, it is clarifying. It tells you the storm was now breaking equipment on large working freighters, not merely making them uncomfortable. If a lifeboat can be smashed by a wave on the Anderson, nobody aboard either vessel is still under the illusion that this is weather to be waited out casually. And this is where the whole story begins to tighten in a different way. Up to this point, the weather has been the main actor. It built, it shifted, it strengthened, it reduced visibility, it raised seas, it started taking fittings and forcing pumps into the foreground. But once a captain reports damage and a list, and once another ship nearby is taking destructive hits from the same lake, the next stage is no longer simply about meteorology. It becomes about communication. What exactly is wrong aboard the Fitzgerald? How bad is the flooding if there is flooding? How fast can she make Whitefish Bay? How much radar is still working? How much control remains? What the men on the Anderson can still see? What they can no longer see? What gets said over the radio when a ship is still moving, still afloat, and yet already beginning to sound less like a confident giant and more like a vessel trying to keep itself together long enough to reach shelter? So this was the moment when the weather stopped being a forecast on paper and became wet metal, broken fittings, cluttered radar, checked speed, and a very practical request to stay nearby. The Edmund Fitzgerald was still heading toward Whitefish, still trying to work its way out of open water and toward relative shelter. But the storm had already made its point. It had turned the lake into a place where experience alone was no longer enough to make anyone feel comfortable, and from here on, what mattered most was what the ships began saying to each other in the dark. By late afternoon on November 10th, the voices on the radio had changed. Not dramatically at first. That is what makes them so unsettling. Nobody was giving a speech. Nobody was announcing that history had arrived. The men speaking over those channels were still doing what working sailors do in bad weather. They were exchanging position information, damage information, questions about equipment, and practical help. The words were plain because the situation was plain to them. A large freighter was hurt. The lake was still building, and another ship nearby was the closest thing to a steady set of eyes in the dark. The radio by then had become more than a convenience. It was the one clean line still connecting the Edmund Fitzgerald to the rest of the world. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Captain Ernest McSorley told Captain Jesse Cooper on the Arthur M. Anderson that the Fitzgerald had sustained topside damage. He said a fence rail was laid down, 2 vents were lost or damaged, and the ship had a list. He said he was checking down his speed and asked the Anderson to stay by him until he reached Whitefish. Cooper asked whether the pumps were running, and McSorley answered that both were. Even stripped of all later meaning, that is a serious exchange. Damage on deck, a list, pumps running, reduced speed, a request for the other vessel to remain close. None of those things say the ship is seconds from disaster, but together they say something had already moved past routine difficulty. Then, at about 4:10 p.m, another important piece fell away. The Fitzgerald radioed the Anderson and reported that both radars had been lost. McSorley asked if the Anderson could provide radar plots until they reached Whitefish Bay, and Cooper agreed to keep him advised of position. That single detail changes the feel of the whole evening. Losing one radar in weather like that would already be serious. Losing both meant the Fitzgerald was now moving through darkness, heavy seas, snow, and poor visibility while depending partly on another ship's eyes and instruments to maintain positional awareness. A giant freighter can still move with damage, it can still move with a list, but once its own radar picture disappears, the world around it becomes narrower, more dependent and much less forgiving. There is something especially hard about that detail because radar is not emotional. It does not comfort you, and it does not panic. It simply gives you information, shoreline there, traffic there, your relation to the bay, the point, the shoal, the other vessel. Remove that picture in the middle of a storm, and a captain is forced back onto radio reports, dead reckoning, experience, and whatever can still be made out through the weather. That does not make him helpless. McSorley was far too experienced for that. But it does make every next decision more expensive. The margin for getting one small thing wrong becomes much thinner. Not long after the radar report, the Fitzgerald tried to pick up the Whitefish Point radio beacon and could not. According to historical timelines and later reporting, the ship called the Coast Guard station at Grand Marais on Channel 16, asking about the status of the beacon and light, and also hailed vessels near a Whitefish Point for information. The Swedish ship Avafors responded. Accounts vary slightly in sequence and wording, but the broad picture is clear. Navigational aids were not being received as expected, and the Fitzgerald was trying to confirm what was functioning ahead of her. In calm weather, this would be a nuisance. In the conditions of that evening, it was one more way in which ordinary certainty was being peeled off the ship piece by piece. That part often gets overlooked because it sounds technical. Beacon status, light visibility, channel calls. But when a ship is already damaged, already listing, already checking down, and already without both radars, those are not side issues. They are the kind of details a captain clings to because they help turn a dangerous approach into a manageable one. Every fixed point matters. Every reliable signal matters. Every assurance that a known landmark is exactly where and how it should be matters. If you are trying to reach Whitefish Bay, you want the world ahead to become clearer, not less certain, sometime between about 5 o'clock and 5:30, or by the broader official window between 5 o'clock and 5:30, and then into about 5:30 to 6 o'clock in later reconstructions. McSorley spoke with Captain Cedric Woodard of the Avafors. The Avafors had the Whitefish Point light in view, though the radio beacon was still not being received, and at one point Woodard reported that to the Fitzgerald. McSorley replied that he was very glad to hear it. That line always lands heavily because it is so modest. Very glad to hear it. Not a dramatic statement, just relief at receiving one useful fact in a hard place. It sounds like exactly what a tired captain might say when a small uncertainty is cleared up and 10 larger ones remain. Then came one of the most memorable overheard fragments in the entire case. While the radio was still live, Woodard on the Avafors apparently heard McSorley say to someone aboard the Fitzgerald, "Don't allow nobody on deck," followed by other words involving a vent that were not clearly understood. That line does not tell us everything, and it should not be exaggerated into more than it is, but it tells us enough. The deck was dangerous enough that the captain did not want anyone out there. Considering the sea state, the spray, the damaged fittings already reported, and the kind of punishment large waves were delivering that evening, that order makes grim practical sense. On a vessel taking heavy water over the deck, a man outside could be injured, swept, or simply unable to move safely where he needed to go. Not long after that, McSorley gave the Avafors a fuller description of the ship's condition. He said the Fitzgerald had a bad list, had lost both radars, and was taking heavy seas over the deck in one of the worst seas he had ever been in. That statement matters because of its tone as much as its content. McSorley was not a young captain inclined to decorative complaints. He had been licensed since the 1930s and had spent decades on the Great Lakes. When a man like that says he is in one of the worst seas he has ever seen, it means something. It does not prove the exact mechanism of the sinking, but it tells you the lived reality on board. The weather was not merely unpleasant, it had reached a level that forced one of the most experienced men on the lake into unusually blunt language. There is a tendency, when people retell famous final messages, to hear them as literary lines. They are almost never that. Real last messages sound like work. They sound clipped, practical, incomplete, and a little unsatisfying. That is because people in real danger usually spend their time dealing with the danger, not crafting a memorable final paragraph for the rest of us. McSorley's reported exchanges fit that pattern perfectly. The comments are not symbolic. They are operational. The ship has a list. The radars are gone. The seas are coming over the deck. Stay by me. Give me plots. Confirm the light. Keep nobody on deck. Every phrase belongs to the job at hand. By about 6:20 p.m, according to the NTSB summary, the Anderson advised the Fitzgerald that she was working a little to the left of the Anderson's heading of 142 degrees true, and confirmed by radio that the Fitzgerald herself was steering about 141 degrees true. At 7 p.m, the Anderson advised that the Fitzgerald was about 10 miles ahead and a little to the left of the Anderson's heading flasher. At 7:10 p.m, the Anderson warned of northbound traffic 9 miles ahead. The Fitzgerald asked in effect whether she would clear, and Cooper replied that the vessel ahead would pass to the west. McSorley answered, "Well, fine." Then Cooper asked how the Fitzgerald was making out with her problem. McSorley gave the reply that has echoed ever since. "We are holding our own." Cooper answered, "Okay, fine, I'll be talking to you later." It is one of the most haunting exchanges in maritime history, precisely because it is not dramatic. We are holding our own. Those 5 words have carried a strange burden for 50 years. They sound steady, they sound practical, they do not sound cheerful, but they do sound composed. There is no mayday in them, no collapse, no shouted alarm, no announcement that the ship is moments from going under. They sound like what a proud, experienced captain might say when he is still fighting the ship, still trying to manage the situation, and still not ready to define himself as beaten. They also sound to some ears like understatement, maybe deliberate understatement. Men of McSorley's generation, especially in hard trades, were not always inclined to dramatise trouble while they were still inside it. And yet those words are slippery. People hear them differently. Some hear determination, some hear professionalism, some hear a captain trying to keep order and morale even if the truth was worse. Some hear exactly what the sentence says, that the ship was damaged and struggling, but still afloat and still moving under control at that moment. The safest thing to say is that the message does not give us certainty. It gives us atmosphere. It tells us the Fitzgerald had not yet declared itself lost. It tells us McSorley was still speaking in the language of endurance, not surrender. It tells us that whatever happened next happened fast enough, or violently enough, or suddenly enough, that no fuller explanation ever followed. This is the point in the story where the dark feels different. Up to then, the radio had still been doing its work. Another ship was there. Courses were being discussed. Traffic was being identified. Questions still had answers. Even a damaged ship sounds less lonely while it is speaking. But after 7:10 p.m, that line into the Fitzgerald goes silent. No final speech follows, no extra report, no second call saying conditions have worsened. Just that answer, calm on its face and impossible to verify from outside, hanging for a few minutes over a lake that was still producing storm-force wind and heavy seas. At about 7:15 p.m, according to later timelines, the Fitzgerald entered a squall and disappeared from the Andersons' radar. That was not immediately treated as proof of disaster, because radar contacts can be obscured in weather and cluttered by conditions. The Andersons' crew initially expected the Fitzgerald to reappear. That detail matters, because it explains the short, terrible gap between the last message and the moment when fear became something harder. For several minutes, the Anderson did not know it was listening to silence after a sinking. It thought it might simply be looking through bad weather at a temporarily hidden ship. That is how disaster often works from the outside. Not with instant clarity, but with delay. A few minutes in which everybody still assumes the ordinary explanation will return. And while the Anderson waited for that radar return, it was taking savage punishment itself. Around 7 p.m, it was struck by two huge waves that drove water high over the vessel and damaged the starboard lifeboat. Other testimony from the Anderson described winds in the 50-knot range, gusts up to 70 or 75 knots, and seas from roughly 18 to 25 feet south of Caribou Island. In other words, the men waiting for the Fitzgerald to reappear were not standing in calm conditions making detached observations. They were on another large freighter in the same storm, fighting their own ship while realizing that the one ahead had gone quiet. There is something especially cruel about that. If the lake had gone calm at once, the absence would have become clear sooner. But the storm kept interfering with understanding. Snow, spray, darkness, wave clutter, emotion. A vessel ahead could disappear into all of that for innocent reasons until it could not. Every minute stretched the line between hope and recognition. You try the radio again. You watch the screen. You tell yourself a squall can do this. You give it another minute, then another. The world does not answer. No distress signal was ever received from the Fitzgerald. The NTSB states plainly that no distress messages were sent after the final communications and that at 8:32 p.m, the Anderson notified the Coast Guard that the Fitzgerald may have suffered a casualty. That timing is worth sitting with. More than an hour passed between "we are holding our own" and the formal report that something may have happened. Not because the Anderson was careless, but because mariners do not leap instantly to the worst conclusion in heavy weather when a ship ahead is temporarily hidden and radio contact is uncertain. They work through the possible explanations first. By the time the Coast Guard was notified that the Fitzgerald may have suffered a casualty, the awful possibility had hardened enough that it could no longer be treated as a passing communications problem. That absence of a distress call has shaped every later theory. It suggests suddenness, but even that must be handled carefully. Sudden compared to what? Sudden enough that no mayday was transmitted. Sudden enough that no one had time or ability to send a final clear explanation. But not necessarily sudden in the sense of no preceding trouble, because the preceding trouble had already been reported in pieces. The list, the damaged vents, the heavy seas, the lost radars, the bad conditions, the need for another vessel's radar assistance. So the silence after 7:10 is not the silence of a ship that had seemed perfectly healthy 1 minute and gone the next. It is the silence of a ship already in difficulty, already speaking more urgently than before, and then abruptly no longer able to say anything at all. That is one reason the final messages continue to feel so alive in people's minds. They are not just the end of communication. They are the edge of understanding. We can hear the ship still functioning as a ship. We can hear navigation, traffic avoidance, damage reporting. Ordinary radio manner, courtesy even. Well, fine. Very glad to hear it. We are holding our own. Those are the sounds of men still working the problem. Then comes the part no transcript can fill in. Not because nobody cared to ask, but because there was nobody left to answer. And the dark out there on eastern Lake Superior would have been absolute in the practical sense. Not philosophically dark, just physically difficult. Snow in the air, heavy water, a black lake. Whitefish Point still ahead. A damaged ship trying to hold course toward relative shelter. Another freighter behind, plotting positions, warning of traffic, and then staring at the space where a radar target should be. Everything about the setting works against last-minute clarity. There is no crowd on shore to witness the final seconds. No one standing nearby with a clean angle on the hull. No cockpit recorder calmly storing every remark. Only radio fragments, weather data, wreck evidence, and the memory of the last ordinary-sounding words. Sometimes people want the final message to solve the mystery, as though if they study the phrasing hard enough the ship will give itself away. But we are holding our own does not yield that kind of answer. It could mean the pumps were keeping pace for the moment. It could mean the captain was refusing to dramatise worsening conditions. It could mean the Fitzgerald still felt controllable even after serious topside damage. It could mean she had already slipped closer to the edge than the words suggest. A final radio line is not a confession. It is only a moment. And this one happened to be the last moment of speech before the lake took over completely. By the time the Anderson and the Coast Guard were forced to accept that the Fitzgerald was not coming back onto the radar, the ship had already gone where voices no longer mattered. Later searches would find wreckage in about 530 feet of water, roughly 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, near the position last associated with her. But none of that was visible yet to the men in the storm. All they had in real time was silence, heavy weather, and the growing realization that a vessel which had been speaking in a steady voice a little earlier was now simply gone. That is where this part of the story leaves us. Not with a final explanation, because no explanation came over the radio. Not with a dramatic farewell, because the Fitzgerald gave none. It leaves us with damaged equipment, a bad list, seas over the deck, a captain telling his crew to stay off the weather deck, another captain trying to guide him in by radar, and one last answer that sounded strong enough to comfort the listener for a few minutes before the lake made that comfort look terribly fragile. From there, all that remained for the men behind her was to call, to wait, to realise the calls were not being answered, and to face the next hard thing the night required, which was to stop listening for another voice and start looking for a ship that was no longer where it had every right to be. What makes the Edmund Fitzgerald's disappearance feel so unnatural is that the ship did not vanish in the way people expect a disaster to vanish. There was no long distress exchange, no flare of public alarm, no drawn-out sequence that let everyone watching understand in real time that the end had arrived. The ship had already reported serious trouble earlier in the evening, and the last confirmed radio exchange came at 7:10 p.m, when Captain Ernest McSorley told the Arthur M. Anderson, "We are holding our own." About 10 minutes later, when the Anderson checked its radar scope, there was no radar contact with the Fitzgerald. Between 7:20 and 8:30, the Anderson tried calling and got no response. At 8:32 p.m, it notified the Coast Guard that the Fitzgerald may have suffered a casualty. No distress call was heard by ships or shore stations, so when people say the ship vanished without a cry, that is true in the practical sense. The Fitzgerald had spoken. It had described damage. It had asked for navigational help. It had reported a bad list, lost radars, and heavy seas over the deck. But when the final break came, no mayday followed it. No one heard a final warning that the ship was going under. The silence came after a series of hard, workmanlike messages, and then it stayed. That is what gives the whole thing its particular force. The vessel did not seem healthy 1 minute and gone the next. It seemed damaged, strained, and still fighting, and then suddenly it was no longer able to say anything at all. A ship that large does not literally disappear, of course. 729 feet of steel cannot vanish like a dropped coin. What disappears is visibility, sequence, witness, and time. The Fitzgerald was ahead of the Anderson in darkness, snow and storm conditions on eastern Lake Superior. The Anderson was fighting the same weather, taking heavy seas itself, and relying on radar and radio to keep track of the ship ahead. By the time the Fitzgerald stopped answering, the lake had already become a place where ordinary seeing no longer worked well. The Anderson's crew could not simply look over and watch what happened. In fact, the NTSB report notes that when the Anderson checked at about 7:20 p.m, visibility had actually improved enough that shore lights more than 20 miles away, and the lights of a northbound vessel about 19 miles away could be seen. Yet the Fitzgerald, which should have been about 10 miles away, was not visible. That detail is chilling because it means the absence had become real, even before anyone was ready to name it as such. This is one of the hardest parts of the story to sit with because the mind naturally wants a picture. It wants a final mechanical sequence it can hold on to. A bow diving, a hull cracking, a wall of water, a violent roll, some clear final event that would at least let the imagination rest. But the exact last moments were not witnessed, and the official investigations never produced a single settled explanation for the final sequence. The 1978 NTSB report made clear that many factors had to be considered, including stability, hull strength, hatch cover integrity, possible grounding, loading practices, vessel design, and weather, which is another way of saying the end was real, but the exact path into it remained uncertain. Later summaries and historical accounts still describe the precise cause as unresolved. That uncertainty is part of why the lack of a distress call matters so much. A ship can fail slowly enough for men to signal. It can fail fast enough that there is no practical chance. The Fitzgerald seems to belong to the second category, or at least to a terrible middle ground where trouble had been building for hours, but the final loss of survivable control happened very quickly. McSorley had already reported a bad list. He had already said the ship was taking heavy seas over the deck in one of the worst seas he had ever encountered. He had already lost both radars. Yet after, "We are holding our own," nothing else came. That pattern strongly suggests that whatever the final event was, it either disabled the ship at once, or escalated faster than a bridge crew could complete a distress transmission. People sometimes imagine that even if the radios fell silent, the crew might still have had time to launch boats and rafts in an organised way. The evidence does not support any comforting version of that idea. The later Coast Guard reporting says that debris was found, including one lifeboat, part of another lifeboat, 2 inflatable life rafts, life jackets, or fragments of them, and miscellaneous flotsam identified as belonging to the Fitzgerald. But no survivors were found and no bodies were recovered. That debris tells us the ship came apart violently enough, or ended abruptly enough, that life-saving equipment entered the water. It does not tell us the crew had a meaningful chance to deploy it in a controlled way. In the conditions reported that night, with storm-force winds and heavy seas, even an attempted orderly abandonment would have been almost unimaginably difficult. And there is another practical point that often gets lost because the phrase, "without a cry," sounds almost literary. The Fitzgerald did cry out, just not in the form people instinctively expect. It cried out through the earlier messages, through the report of lost vents, through the report of a list, through the pumps running, through the request for the Anderson to stay by, through the request for radar assistance, through the confirmation that Whitefish Point's radio beacon was not operating, through the order not to let anyone on deck, and through the blunt admission that the ship was in one of the worst seas McSorley had ever seen. Those were warnings. They were just warnings spoken in the language of sailors still doing their jobs. The final silence matters because it cut off that language before it could turn into a formal alarm. A giant ship can vanish this way because size is not the same thing as margin. The Fitzgerald was enormous by Great Lakes standards, but it was still a machine moving through a violent fluid environment under very specific conditions. A big vessel is not protected from the laws that govern loading, flooding, structural strain, wave timing, and sudden loss of stability. In some ways, size creates its own special vulnerabilities. Long ships can be punished by repeated wave action over their full length. Water getting into cargo spaces or compartments does not need long to become decisive once control begins to slip. And in darkness, with heavy seas and failed radar, a captain's ability to diagnose exactly which problem is about to become the fatal one can narrow very quickly. The unresolved cause is frustrating, but the broad lesson is not mysterious at all. A giant can look steady until the exact moment its remaining margin is gone. The wreck location adds another layer to that feeling. The NTSB reported that the wreckage identified as the Fitzgerald was found in position 46 degrees 59.9 minutes north, 85 degrees 6.6 minutes west, in about 530 feet of water in eastern Lake Superior, just north of the international boundary in Canadian waters, and that this position correlated with the last position reported by the Anderson. Other reputable summaries describe it as roughly 17 miles from Whitefish Bay, or northwest of Whitefish Point. That detail matters because the ship was not lost out in some impossibly remote central void. It was relatively near the place toward which it had been trying to make its way. It was close enough to land, close enough to navigational reference points, and close enough to the relative shelter of Whitefish Bay to make the loss feel even harsher. It did not sink at the beginning of the struggle. It sank after enduring it for hours and while still trying to get in. When the wreck was eventually surveyed, it was found in 2 large pieces on the lakebed. That fact has fueled arguments for decades about whether the ship broke apart on the surface as it was sinking or on impact with the bottom. The important point here is not to force that later evidence into a certainty it does not provide. The ship was found broken. That is true. But the broken wreck does not by itself tell us the exact visual story of the final minute above water. What it does tell us is that the end was violent enough to leave the vessel in separated major sections, with cargo and wreckage between them. So even the lakebed evidence agrees with the radio evidence on one central point. The Fitzgerald did not settle gently out of the conversation. It suffered a rapid, catastrophic end. There is also the simple matter of human expectation. Everyone who knew the ship had been trained in a quiet way not to expect this from it. The Edmund Fitzgerald was not a frail coaster. It was not an overloaded little craft operating far beyond its design. It was one of the best-known working freighters on the lakes, with an experienced captain and crew. That is why the silence after 7:10 p.m. feels so much larger than an ordinary communication loss. If a vessel like that can stop answering in bad weather and then be gone for good, the lake begins to look different in the mind. It looks less like a route, and more like a place that keeps ultimate control even over the ships built specifically to cross it. And still, it is important not to turn this into something supernatural. The disappearance was shocking, but it was not magic. The Anderson did not lose the Fitzgerald because of folklore. It lost it because of darkness, distance, storm conditions, radar limitations, and the speed with which the final casualty unfolded. The Coast Guard was not slow to understand because anyone was careless. The first report at 8:32 p.m. came after repeated attempts to raise the Fitzgerald and after the ordinary assumption, reasonable in heavy weather, that a temporary radar loss or radio interruption might still resolve itself. Disasters seen from nearby often contain those awful extra minutes when people do not yet know that the normal explanation has already died. That is the true shape of a giant ship vanishing without a cry. Not theatrical silence, but interrupted work. Not one dramatic shout swallowed by the storm, but a series of practical messages cut off before the final one could be sent. Not immediate public certainty, but a growing recognition aboard another freighter that the ship ahead was no longer where it should be. No longer answering, no longer visible even when other lights could be seen through the clearing distance. And once that recognition settled in, the story changed again. Because the men on the Anderson and the authorities ashore had to stop waiting for one more routine reply and begin the next grim task instead, which was to search storm water and dark shoreline for any sign that the Fitzgerald had left behind something more than silence. Once the radio went quiet, the story changed from a maritime emergency into a search. That sounds clean when you say it quickly. It was not clean at all in the actual moment. The Arthur M. Anderson did not lose contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald and instantly know that a sinking had taken place. It lost the radar target, tried calling, kept trying, and only gradually moved from ordinary concern into the terrible possibility that the ship ahead had suffered a major casualty. The NTSB report states that the Anderson last had normal communication with the Fitzgerald at 7:10 p.m, saw no radar contact when checked at about 7:20 p.m, and after repeated unsuccessful attempts to raise the vessel, notified the Coast Guard at 8:32 p.m. that the Fitzgerald may have suffered a casualty. That hour between silence and report is one of the cruelest parts of the night because it was filled not with certainty, but with waiting. Waiting in a storm is not passive. That is important to remember. Captain Jesse Cooper and the crew of the Anderson were not sitting comfortably in calm water, frowning at a quiet radio and deciding what to do over coffee. Their own ship was still in violent weather. Earlier that evening, the Anderson had been hit by huge seas, one of which smashed its starboard lifeboat. The lake had not settled down simply because another vessel had vanished. The men aboard the Anderson were trying to locate a missing freighter, while also managing the same storm that had likely destroyed it. In other words, the search began inside the exact conditions that made searching so difficult in the first place. That is part of what gives this section of the story its particular heaviness. In some disasters, once the emergency is recognised, the rescue begins under improving conditions. The weather breaks, dawn arrives, visibility opens, more units converge. Search patterns become possible in the reassuring way we like to imagine them. On Lake Superior that night, there was no such kindness. Darkness remained, wind remained, heavy seas remained, snow and spray remained. The only thing that changed quickly was the understanding that the Fitzgerald was no longer where it should be. Everything else stayed hostile. The first searcher, naturally, was the ship that had been talking to the Fitzgerald only minutes earlier. The Anderson turned and began looking for signs of the missing vessel and for possible survivors. There is something almost unbearable about that image once you slow it down. A large ore carrier in storm water, turning back through darkness, trying to search for another large ore carrier that had not gone out with a dramatic explosion or a visible flare, but had simply stopped answering. The lake offers no helpful stage lighting in a moment like that. It offers black water, hard wind, and scattered lights that may mean something or may mean nothing at all. At around 10:30 that night, according to later summaries based on the rescue record, the Coast Guard asked commercial vessels anchored in or near Whitefish Bay to help in the search. That detail tells you something important about Great Lakes life. On those waters, when a ship is missing, other ships become part of the response very quickly. Not because anyone imagines a nearby freighter is better equipped than the Coast Guard in some abstract sense, but because in bad conditions the vessels already on scene may be the only ones close enough to act immediately. On the lakes, the first search grid is often built out of whoever is already there, whoever can turn, whoever can shine lights into the dark and call into the wind and hope the lake has not already decided the matter. The United States Coast Guard responded by air and by water, but even that practical phrase hides how awkward the effort had to be. A fixed-wing Coast Guard search aircraft from Traverse City arrived on scene at about 10:53 p.m, and an HH-52 helicopter with a powerful searchlight arrived around 1 a.m. on November 11th. Canadian Coast Guard aircraft joined the effort as well, and the search extended over several days, with surface and air units from both countries, merchant vessels and shoreline patrols all involved. That is a substantial response, but the lake and the weather remained in charge of the terms. Aircraft can search, helicopters can search, surface units can search, but in a storm, none of them search cleanly. One of the most painful features of this search is how quickly it stopped being a rescue in the hopeful sense and became a hunt for evidence. When a ship goes missing and there are no voices on the radio, search crews are looking for two categories of things at once. They are looking for people, and they are looking for proof. A flare, a raft, an oil slick, a life ring, broken timber, a boat. Debris can be heartbreaking, but at least it confirms where to keep looking. A total absence of debris is somehow worse for a while, because it means the searchers are still trying to reason outward from silence. The Fitzgerald search passed through that stage before the lake began returning fragments. Later reports show just how little comfort those fragments offered. The NTSB states that after an intensive search by US and Canadian Coast Guard surface and air units, Michigan Air National Guard aircraft, and merchant vessels between November 10th and 13th, no survivors were found and no bodies were recovered. The total life-saving equipment recovered included one lifeboat, one half of another lifeboat, 2 inflatable life rafts, and 21 life jackets or life jacket pieces. That inventory is so stark because it tells 2 stories at once. First, the ship had indeed been destroyed. Second, the destruction had been so rapid and so severe that the life-saving gear was in the water without the men who would have needed to use it. There is no gentle way to say what that implies. If a lifeboat is found badly damaged, and if no survivors are found in rafts, and if no bodies are recovered despite a large multi-day search, the room for comforting scenarios becomes very small. The National Weather Service historical summary says the lifeboats were found badly damaged, indicating they were not launched but instead smashed while still secured to the ship, and that the Coast Guard concluded the Fitzgerald sank abruptly. That does not solve the ultimate cause of the sinking, but it does sharpen the character of the final minutes. This was not a long organised abandonment, it was something faster and more violent, and imagine what the shoreline search must have felt like. The official record notes that Ontario Provincial Police conducted numerous shoreline searches along the eastern shore of Lake Superior. Shoreline searching in the aftermath of a wreck sounds almost calmer than ship and aircraft searching, but it has its own kind of grimness. Men walking beaches and rock lines in cold weather are not looking for drama. They are looking for whatever the water chooses to surrender. A jacket, a ring buoy, a splintered part of a boat, something with paint on it, something with a name. It is patient work, and it takes a particular kind of strength, because every object found confirms the same thing in a slightly different way. The Whitefish Point area already had a reputation long before the Fitzgerald was lost. The waters there had taken many ships over the years, which is why the area is often called part of the graveyard of the Great Lakes. That broader setting matters because it changes how the search would have been understood by the people working it. They were not searching in an innocent place. They were searching in water with a history, not supernatural history, not folklore in place of fact, but a long practical history of storms, wrecks, difficult approaches, and very cold consequences. There is a reason Whitefish Point has become such a strong symbol in Great Lakes memory. It sits at the edge of roots and weather in a way that keeps drawing stories toward it. By November 14th, 4 days after the Fitzgerald disappeared, the search had moved from scanning the surface for survivors and debris to locating the ship itself. On that day, a US Navy aircraft equipped with a magnetic anomaly detector found a strong contact about 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. The National Weather Service says the contact was about 17 miles northwest of the point, under about 535 feet of water, while the NTSB gives the wreck position more precisely in Canadian waters, just north of the international boundary at about 530 feet. In practical terms, the ship was where the evidence had been pointing. Not impossibly far from Whitefish Bay, not in some bizarre remote corner of the lake, but out there in deep water near the area where it had last been expected. There is something brutally efficient about that discovery. For days, the lake had been returning fragments and silence. Then a sensor in a Navy plane located the mass of the ship on the bottom. A giant freighter that had once moved visibly across harbours, and channels had become an anomaly beneath deep water. It is one of those transformations that history can state in a sentence, and the imagination still resists. A vessel that people had watched from shore for years was now a magnetic contact under Lake Superior. The language becomes colder as the reality becomes more final. The Coast Guard cutter Woodrush then surveyed the area over the next several days and located 2 large pieces of wreckage in the same vicinity. The NWS summary says the Woodrush found 2 large pieces under about 535 feet of water during the following 3 days, and later imagery from a Navy underwater recovery vehicle on May 20th, 1976, clearly showed the words Edmund Fitzgerald on the stern section. That matters not because anyone seriously doubted the identity by that point, but because wreck confirmation has a strange role in maritime disasters. It ends one uncertainty and begins another. Once the wreck is found, no one is still waiting for the ship to come limping into port. But now the harder questions begin. Why here? Why like this? Why no distress call? Why in 2 pieces? For the families, though, the search and the discovery were not abstract transitions from one investigative phase to another. They were a progression from fear to grief without the relief of survivors in between. There were no rescue crewmen to interview, no hospital rooms, no shaken but living witnesses wrapped in blankets saying the ship went down fast. The search found wreckage, equipment, and eventually the ship. It did not bring back the 29 men aboard. That absence shaped everything that followed, from the investigations to the public memory of the disaster. A shipwreck with survivors becomes partly a story told by the people who escaped. A shipwreck with no survivors becomes a story told by evidence, weather, and the people left behind. There is also something about the timing of the search that lingers. November 10th to November 13th for the main surface and air effort. November 14th for the magnetic detection of the wreck. Then additional sonar work and later underwater photography. On paper, it is a sequence of dates. In emotional terms, it is a drawn-out hardening of the truth. First, a ship may have suffered a casualty. Then there is debris. Then there are no survivors. Then there is a contact on the bottom. Then there are 2 large pieces. Then there are images. At no point does the process become easier. It simply becomes more definite. Searches on large cold lakes are cruelly limited by the very conditions that make the wrecks famous. Water temperature matters, wave height matters, darkness matters, distance from sheltered shore matters. So does simple geography. Lake Superior is not just large, it is deep, and deep water changes everything. Once a vessel sinks there, especially in cold storm conditions at night, the odds move against rescue with brutal speed. Even before official reports reach their conclusions, the lake has already done its practical arithmetic. Search crews still go, they must go, but often they are racing not only distance and weather, but time that has already nearly run out. That helps explain why the later discovery of the wreck felt both clarifying and unsatisfying. It told the world where the Fitzgerald had gone, but not yet how or why in final terms. The search across Lake Superior was successful in the narrow sense that it located the ship and established the broad fact of catastrophic loss. It was unsuccessful in the human sense that matters most to families and to ordinary imagination. It found no survivors, it recovered no bodies, it offered no direct eyewitness testimony from the final minutes. It gave investigators a place, a pattern of wreckage, and a field of debris. It did not give them a voice from inside the sinking. Even the objects recovered carried a harsh kind of silence. A lifeboat, half of another, inflatable rafts, pieces of life jackets. Those items are supposed to belong to the phase after disaster begins. They are meant to be the bridge between catastrophe and survival. Found alone, damaged, or empty, they become evidence of speed and violence instead. The searchers were not just finding floating equipment, they were finding proof that the ship had gone down too fast or too badly for the ordinary sequence of emergency response aboard ship to unfold. That is one reason the Fitzgerald continues to feel so immediate in memory. The search did not reveal a long struggle in the water. It revealed a ship that seems to have crossed from hard trouble to total loss with terrifying speed. There is a temptation in historical retelling to compress searches into a few brisk lines, and move on to the more glamorous part, which is usually the wreck itself on the bottom. But the search is one of the most human parts of the whole story. It is the part where hope has not entirely died yet, where radio calls still go out, where other mariners turn to help, where aircraft fly into ugly weather, where shore patrols walk cold coastlines, and where every small discovery still contains two competing meanings. A raft could mean men escaped, a lifeboat could mean someone launched it, a piece of wreckage could mean you are in the right area. The search is where people keep believing, one object at a time, until the objects themselves make belief smaller. And because the Fitzgerald was such a well-known vessel, the search also took on a public life very quickly. This was not an obscure freighter disappearing without notice. It was a giant that people knew by name. Every update mattered. Every confirmed detail widened the circle of grief. The discovery of the wreck did not close the story. It made the loss undeniable and shifted the question from "where is the ship?" to "what happened down there?" That transition is where the narrative begins turning from emergency into investigation, from search patterns on the surface into sonar, cameras, and the long, difficult work of interpreting wreckage. So the search across Lake Superior ended the first uncertainty but left the larger mystery intact. The Fitzgerald had not drifted away disabled. It had not reached harbour unheard. It was on the bottom, in deep, cold water, in two main pieces, with debris scattered and no survivors found. The lake had yielded enough to prove the disaster, but not enough to explain it cleanly. And that is why the next part of this story moves downward, from aircraft, cutters, and shoreline patrols into the black, cold world below, where the ship lay in silence and investigators began studying the wreck itself for answers the storm had refused to give on the surface. Once the search located the Edmund Fitzgerald on the bottom of Lake Superior, the story changed again. Up on the surface for several days, the lake had been a place of absence, missing radar, missing voices, empty water where a very large ship should have been. But once the wreck was found, the absence turned into a shape. Not an answer, not yet, but a shape. On November 14th, 1975, a US Navy aircraft using a magnetic anomaly detector found a strong contact about 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, and in the days that followed, the Coast Guard cutter Woodrush located two large pieces of wreckage in about 530 to 535 feet of water. The location matched the area where the Fitzgerald was expected to be after the last reports from the Arthur M. Anderson. That depth matters more than people sometimes realise. 530 feet does not sound theatrical when spoken aloud, but it is deep enough to remove the wreck from all ordinary human habits of seeing. Once the Fitzgerald went down there, it entered a world of cold, darkness, pressure, and stillness. The ship that had once moved through harbours in full daylight and drawn attention from shore was now lying in a place no one could simply visit by leaning over a rail. The wreck was no longer part of the living traffic of the lakes. It had become a problem of instruments, cameras, sonar, and interpretation. And the first broad fact the lakebed revealed was that the Fitzgerald was not resting there whole. The wreck was in two major pieces. The NTSB later wrote that the proximity of the bow and stern sections on the bottom indicated the vessel sank in one piece and broke apart either as it descended or when it hit bottom, rather than suffering a massive structural failure of the hull while still on the surface. That conclusion is important, because people naturally imagine a giant ship breaking in half on the waves in some dramatic visible instant. The board's interpretation pointed in a colder direction. The ship in this reading was already lost before the final breaking became visible in the wreck itself. That idea changes the emotional picture. It suggests the lakebed was not simply preserving the cause of death in neat mechanical form. It was preserving the remains of a ship that had already crossed the line into catastrophe before it struck the bottom hard enough or descended in such a way that the final separation occurred. That is one reason the wreck has never settled the whole mystery by itself. A wreck can tell you where forces ended. it cannot always tell you where they began. The Fitzgerald lying in two pieces is dramatic evidence, but not tidy evidence. It proves violence. It does not automatically narrate the entire sequence above. When the US Navy's underwater recovery vehicle photographed the wreck on May 20th, 1976, the images made the loss feel even more real. The National Weather Service notes that the pictures clearly showed the words Edmund Fitzgerald on the stern piece of the sunken ship. That detail sounds small, but it matters because identification has a strange emotional role in shipwrecks. Everyone may already know what the wreck is. Still, seeing the name there still attached to steel lying on the lakebed turns the abstract into something stubbornly physical. The ship was not merely presumed lost. It was there. It had a name. It was broken. The later descriptions of the wreck make it one of those images that settles into the mind and stays there. Smithsonian's recent summary, based on the historical photography and later expeditions, says the stern was upside down on the lakebed, while the bow was upright about 170 feet away, with the middle section missing between them. That arrangement is unsettling because it does not look like rest. It looks like interruption. One end inverted, one end upright. A gap where part of the ship's body should be. It is the kind of layout that tells you immediately, before any theory begins, that the descent and impact were not gentle events. The bow and stern also speak differently. The bow, by most descriptions, lies upright and partly buried in the lakebed mud. The stern, by contrast, is overturned. Those different final positions give the wreck an almost split personality. One part still resembles a ship in the ordinary sense, as though it might simply be stranded in a place no ship can remain. The other part looks more obviously ruined, turned away from its natural posture. Even without using any technical theory at all, the visual arrangement says that tremendous forces acted on the vessel in its last descent, and then there is the missing middle. That missing central portion has helped keep the Fitzgerald mysterious because it leaves the eye wanting continuity and getting only debris. Between the two major sections lay a confused wreck field rather than a neat explanatory bridge. Cargo, structure, broken material, and the aftermath of a giant freighter's destruction was spread across the bottom. The ship's body had not been preserved in a way that lets later viewers trace a single clean line from bow to stern. Instead, it had become evidence in pieces. That matters because when people say they want the wreck to tell them what happened, what they often mean is that they want it to tell them in a simple sentence. The Fitzgerald does not do that. It tells you in fragments. One of the most important things investigators drew from the wreck was not what broke on the bottom, but what probably did not happen on the surface. The NTSB's analysis argued that stress levels from longitudinal bending moments were well below what would have been expected to cause a structural failure of the hull while the ship was still afloat. In other words, the board did not accept the idea that the vessel simply snapped in half on the surface under wave action alone before sinking. That does not mean the weather was unimportant. It means the wreck suggested the ship first lost buoyancy and stability, sank, and then broke apart during descent or bottom impact. That conclusion has always mattered because it pushes the story away from the most cinematic version of events. A giant ship dramatically tearing open across the tops of storm waves is easy to picture. A giant ship flooding, losing freeboard, losing stability, plunging under, and only then breaking apart is harder to picture, and much more frightening in a practical way. It means the wreck is not the record of a single theatrical snap. It is the record of a ship that could no longer remain a ship in the world above water. The lakebed also told investigators something by what it did not provide. There were no survivors, no bodies recovered, and no witness testimony from the wreck itself. That may sound obvious, but it shaped everything. A wreck with survivors becomes partly a human story told after the fact. A wreck with no survivors becomes a conversation with metal, mud, scattered gear, and official inference. The NTSB was very direct on this point. Because there were neither witnesses nor survivors, and because the scattered wreckage on the lake bottom did not indicate a definite mode of hull failure, The actual sequence of events culminating in the sinking could not be completely substantiated. That sentence is one of the most honest and important in the whole case. So the wreck had limits from the beginning. It could reveal where the ship was, how it lay, and something about the violence of the ending. It could support some theories and weaken others, but it could not simply speak the final minute back into existence. A lot of famous shipwrecks tempt people into thinking that enough photography will turn mystery into certainty. Sometimes that works, sometimes it does not. The Fitzgerald belongs to the second category. The more clearly people saw it, the more definite the loss became, but not the more final the explanation became. There is another detail on the bottom that has always had a peculiar emotional power, the stern still showing the ship's name. It is hard to overstate how much that matters in public memory. A freighter name painted on steel is an ordinary thing when the vessel is alive. On the lakebed, it becomes almost accusatory in its plainness. This is not just wreckage, this is that wreckage. The famous vessel everyone had been talking about, the ship heard on the radio only hours before, the one with 29 men aboard, is now upside down in cold, dark water with its own name still visible on it. No storyteller needs to embellish that image. The image already does the work. Later expeditions made the wreck even more familiar to the public, though not necessarily more interpretable. The Great Lakes Shipwreck. Historical Society says it conducted 3 underwater expeditions to the wreck in 1989, 1994, and 1995. Those dives helped keep the site in public attention, and they also changed the Fitzgerald from a single moment of discovery into an ongoing place of memory and investigation. Once a wreck is revisited, photographed again, and discussed in relation to family memory and public history, it stops being only a marine casualty and becomes a kind of underwater monument. That word, monument, needs to be handled carefully. The Fitzgerald is not a monument in the pleasant sense. It is a grave site, a technical puzzle, and a regional wound all at once. Later attention to the wreck forced people to balance curiosity against respect. This was not just a fascinating piece of underwater engineering evidence, it was where 29 men died. Smithsonian notes that footage from a 1994 expedition included an image of what appeared to be a crewman, and family protests helped push the Canadian government toward protecting the area as a gravesite. That detail matters because it explains why discussion of the wreck always carries a different tone from discussion of some long-abandoned vessel from an earlier century. The Edmund Fitzgerald is still close enough to living memory that ethics matter as much as curiosity. The 1995 expedition gave the wreck one of its most symbolic moments. According to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, Fitzgerald's 200-pound bronze bell was recovered on July 4th, 1995, during a joint expedition involving the Society, the National Geographic Society, the Canadian Navy, Sony, and the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. The bell was later placed in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point as a memorial to the crew, and a replica engraved with the names of the crew was left at the wreck site. The National Weather Service notes that at the November 10th, 1995 ceremony, the bell was rung 30 times, once for each crew member and once for all who have lost their lives at sea. That bell recovery matters in this story because it reveals something about how people relate to wrecks. We say we want explanations, and we do, but we also want an object we can stand beside. Something that has come back from the depth, carrying a little of the ship's identity with it. A bell is especially powerful that way because bells are already bound up with time, warning, ceremony and memory. Bringing the Fitzgerald's bell up from 500 plus feet of cold water did not solve the sinking, but it gave grief somewhere solid to go. It allowed the wreck to remain below, while one unmistakable piece of the ship entered the world of memorial rather than theory. Still, even the bell could not quiet the technical questions that the wreck kept raising. The board's analysis and the Coast Guard's earlier report both looked at flooding as central, especially flooding that may have entered through hatch cover openings once the ship's freeboard was reduced, and the weather became severe. The NTSB wrote that in order for the Fitzgerald to have developed a bad list 2 hours after the list was first reported, flooding must have exceeded the vessel's pumping capacity, or flooding through the hatch cover openings and hatch coamings must have contributed significantly to the list. It also said the master probably did not realise the extent of flooding in the cargo hold until the water level exceeded the height of the cargo. That is a very sobering reading of the wreck and the final radio traffic together. It suggests a ship can still appear to be fighting on, even as the decisive loss of buoyancy is already underway below the most meaningful line. At the same time, the wreck did not let everyone settle comfortably into one cause. The possibility of damage from shoaling near Caribou Island remained part of the conversation. The severe weather remained part of the conversation. The exact role of hatch covers remained part of the conversation. The board itself acknowledged that the final sequence could not be completely substantiated, so the wreck on the bottom became one of those rare historical objects that is both very revealing and permanently incomplete. It shows enough to sharpen the argument. It does not show enough to end it, and that incompleteness is part of why the site still grips people. If the Fitzgerald had been found intact, gently settled, with one obvious clean failure visible to every later observer, the story might have become colder and simpler with time. Instead, the wreck remains physically dramatic and interpretively stubborn. 2 major sections, missing middle, stern upside down, bow upright, deep water, name still visible. Bell later recovered. No survivors to narrate the final descent. It is almost perfectly built to hold attention, because it offers proof without closure. There is also something very Lake Superior about the wreck's preservation. Cold fresh water is different from warm salt water. It can preserve certain wreck features in a way that makes them feel less eroded by time than ocean wrecks of similar age might seem. That can create an eerie effect in the imagination. The Fitzgerald is not some medieval suggestion of a ship. It is recognisably a 20th century industrial giant, still itself enough to be named, still modern enough to feel recent, and recent enough that many of the families who lost men aboard it remain deeply involved in how the site was treated. The wreck is not distant history in the emotional sense. It feels close enough to touch, even though almost nobody ever should. And that brings us to the hardest truth the wreck offers. It does not behave like a final witness standing up in court and delivering a single decisive testimony. It behaves more like a damaged witness who can only answer certain questions. Yes, the ship is here. Yes, it came down hard. Yes, it lies in 2 major pieces. Yes, the final destruction was abrupt and catastrophic. No, it does not clearly reveal every step that led there. No, it does not eliminate all rival explanations. No, it does not let us hear what the men aboard understood in the last minute that no one else ever heard. So when people picture the wreck on the bottom of Lake Superior, what they are really picturing is not just a sunken ship. They are picturing the point where certainty ends and evidence begins. The lake gave back enough for the world to know the Fitzgerald was gone, broken, and resting deep below the surface. It did not give back enough to make the argument stop, and that is why, once the wreck had been found and photographed and remembered and honoured, the story had no choice but to move into the next long phase, where investigators, mariners, families and historians all kept asking the same thing from slightly different angles. What combination of damage, flooding, wave force, and bad luck turned this famous ship into that silent wreck on the bottom of the lake? By the time people reached this part of the story, the most natural hope was that the wreck and the reports would produce one clean answer. They did not. What they produced instead was something much more familiar to anyone who has ever looked closely at a real disaster. They produced a strong official explanation, a set of weaker or competing explanations, and a long trail of questions that never fully went away. That can feel frustrating, because the human mind likes shipwrecks to behave like puzzles in children's books. One missing piece, one final fit, one satisfied nod. The Edmund Fitzgerald refused to be that kind of case. The ship left evidence, but not enough to end every argument. The weather left evidence, but not enough to make weather alone the whole answer. The final radio calls left evidence, but not enough to turn the last minutes into a simple timeline. So what remained was not one theory, but a field of theories, with some standing on much stronger ground than others. The official position that carried the most institutional weight came first from the Coast Guard, and then, in a somewhat different form, from the National Transportation Safety Board. The NTSB concluded in 1978 that the probable cause of the loss was sudden massive flooding of the cargo hold due to the collapse of one or more hatch covers. It also said that before those covers collapsed, topside damage had allowed flooding into ballast tanks and the tunnel, and water entering through non-weather-tight hatch covers had reduced freeboard and produced a list. At that reduced freeboard, with the ship already listing and heavy boarding seas coming across the deck, the forces on the hatch covers became too great, and one or more failed. The board also identified contributing factors, including the lack of transverse watertight bulkheads in the cargo hold, and the reduced freeboard permitted by earlier load line amendments. That is a very technical explanation, so it helps to slow it down and make it sound like the thing it actually describes. The theory says the Fitzgerald did not die from one dramatic cinematic blow. It died because it got lower in the water, more vulnerable, and less able to keep the lake out. Damage up top and through openings that were not truly weathertight let water begin getting in where it should not. That made the ship ride lower and lean. Once it was lower and leaning in very heavy seas, waves coming over the deck imposed much greater loads on the hatch covers. At some point, one or more hatch covers failed, and then the cargo hold took on water quickly enough to kill the ship. In that reading, the end was sudden, but the setup had been building. The Coast Guard's position was close to that, but not identical. The Commandant concurred with the Marine Board that the most probable cause was loss of buoyancy, resulting from massive flooding of the cargo hold due to ineffective hatch closures, and the search results summary of the report reflects that wording. That difference in wording matters a little. The Coast Guard emphasis left more room for the idea that hatch closure effectiveness itself was central, rather than the narrower picture of covers collapsing only after conditions worsened enough. The distinction may sound small, but in a famous case, small distinctions grow teeth. Was the problem that the hatches were not secured properly, or that they were secured as designed and the design itself was inadequate, or that they were initially adequate but later overwhelmed by extraordinary conditions after the ship was already damaged and low in the water? Those are not the same accusation. That is why the hatch cover theory has always carried such emotional weight. It was never just an engineering question. It touched the reputations of men who had worked the ship and men who had died aboard it. Later discussion, including a recent Smithsonian review of the case, notes that the hatch closure explanation remained controversial and that some former crewmen and family members strongly resisted the suggestion that the deck crew would have left the covers improperly secured. Smithsonian also notes that images of the wreck showed only a few clamps appearing damaged, which investigators saw as one reason to suspect the closures had not all been effective. But critics argued that this reading was unfair and not conclusive. In other words, even the wreck did not settle the hatch question in a way everyone accepted. And once you say that out loud, the next question comes immediately. If people were not satisfied with the hatch explanation alone, what did they think happened instead? One major alternative has always involved shoaling or bottoming out near Caribou Island, especially around 6 Fathom Shoal or the North Bank area. Captain Jesse Cooper of the Anderson believed the Fitzgerald had passed close to dangerous shallows north of Caribou Island, and the Coast Guard report devoted real attention to the hydrographic survey of that area. The survey found several soundings of 6 fathoms or less, including spots shallower than some existing charts showed, which meant there really were places there where clearance could have been tighter than mariners might have assumed from older chart data. That does not prove the Fitzgerald struck bottom, but it does establish that the shoal theory was not invented out of thin air by restless imaginations decades later. The authorities took it seriously enough to investigate the underwater topography in detail. The attraction of the shoaling theory is easy to understand. It explains several things at once. It could explain topside damage. It could explain how a ship might develop a list before the final catastrophe. It could explain why the Fitzgerald was in obvious trouble before the radio fell silent. And it fits one of the story's most stubborn features, which is that the vessel reported physical damage and a bad list well before it disappeared. Later historical writing in Smithsonian notes that some researchers remain intrigued by the possibility that the ship bottomed out over 6 Fathom Shoal, in part because that would make sense of incoming water and the developing list. But even there, the evidence stops short of certainty. The board did not officially conclude that grounding caused the sinking, and no final piece of proof has emerged that forces everyone into agreement. That is where this case becomes very human again. Because if you cannot prove grounding outright, and you cannot prove a simple hatch negligence story in a way that satisfies everyone, then the disaster starts looking less like a single cause failure and more like a chain. Damage of some kind, water entering somewhere, reduced freeboard, worsening seas, possibly compromised closures, more water, greater list, greater loads, final loss of buoyancy. That kind of chain is less satisfying to the mind because it denies us the comfort of one villain. But it often looks more like real life. The weather theories sit beside that chain rather than outside it. The 2006 weather reanalysis, highlighted by the National Weather Service, found that the worst conditions were coincident with the time and location of the Fitzgerald's loss, with sustained winds near storm force, about 48 knots, and significant waves of more than 25 feet near where the ship disappeared. More recent popular summaries, including Smithsonian, note expert estimates that the vessel may have encountered 2 or 3 waves around 50 feet, and perhaps even 1 or 2 around 60 feet. That does not mean a single rogue wave neatly solved the mystery. It means the ship appears to have met the storm at a very bad place, and a very bad time, in conditions that may have been worse locally than many earlier broad summaries captured. Now, the rogue wave or Three Sisters idea has obvious appeal. It feels immediate. It feels visual. It says, in effect, that the lake delivered an extraordinary sequence of waves powerful enough to overwhelm even a giant freighter, and there is certainly no shortage of wave energy in the official and later weather work. But weather by itself does not answer every question. If a monster sequence of waves struck the Fitzgerald, why had the ship already reported a bad list, lost vents, and other trouble beforehand? Why had McSorley already said he was in one of the worst seas he'd ever been in, and asked the Anderson to stay by? Why were both pumps already running? Those details suggest a vessel already under stress, not a perfectly healthy ship that simply met one unlucky wall of water. That is why even people drawn to the wave theory often end up describing cascading failures instead of one clean event. The idea of structural failure on the surface also has its supporters in public memory, because the wreck lies in 2 major pieces, and people naturally connect the broken wreck to a ship breaking apart above water. But the NTSB did not favour that conclusion. The board said the proximity of the 2 main wreck sections suggested the vessel sank in one piece, and broke apart either while descending or on impact with the bottom. It also stated that the scattered wreckage on the lake floor did not indicate a definite mode of hull failure, and that the actual sequence of events could not be completely substantiated, because there were neither witnesses nor survivors. That is one of the most important correctives in the entire story. A broken wreck does not automatically prove a surface breakup. In fact, the official reports were fairly sceptical that ordinary wave-induced hull stress alone snapped the ship while it was still afloat. That matters because it removes one of the simpler dramatic explanations. The Fitzgerald may have ended as 2 large sections, but the stronger official reading is that it first lost buoyancy, and only then came apart during the downward part of the story. That is a colder answer than people often want, because it replaces a dramatic crack with flooding and progressive loss. Still, cold answers are often the ones disasters leave behind. Then there is the question of freeboard. which sounds technical and is technical, but turns out to be one of the most important quiet details. Freeboard is, in simple terms, how much ship remains above the waterline. More freeboard gives you more margin before heavy seas start regularly boarding the deck and turning everything ugly. The NTSB explicitly pointed to reduced freeboard permitted by the 1969, 1971 and 1973 amendments to the Great Lakes Load Line Regulations as a contributing factor. It also recommended further investigation into whether those deeper permitted drafts had increased flooding potential because of the designs of existing weathertight closures. That is a major point, because it means the board was not looking only at one ship and one storm. It was looking at the possibility that the regulatory environment had allowed Great Lakes or carriers to run with less vertical safety margin than was wise for the realities of the lakes. That kind of finding is less dramatic than a single catastrophic wave, but it is often more consequential in the long run. It suggests that the Fitzgerald may have been operating inside rules that looked acceptable on paper and looked efficient in commerce, while being less forgiving in brutal real conditions. The board also recommended improved hatch cover and clamp design, stronger inspection of hatch covers, hatch coamings and vents, and better subdivision and damage stability standards for Great Lakes cargo vessels. In plain language, the investigators did not respond to this disaster as though it had been one freak accident with no broader lessons. They responded as though the ship's loss exposed weaknesses in design, closure integrity, stability and safety practice that extended beyond one night. There is another quiet but important question in the case, and it concerns not what damaged the ship, but what the captain could actually know about that damage in real time. The NTSB noted that installation of trim and list indicating instruments on the Fitzgerald would have given the master earlier and clearer warning of flooding and would have helped show whether corrective action was working. It also suggested that McSorley probably did not know the full extent of cargo hold flooding until the water level rose above the taconite cargo. That is a deeply sobering possibility. It means the man on the bridge may have understood he was in trouble without being able to see the true scale of the trouble soon enough. A ship can be dying below the line of easy observation while still answering the radio in a steady voice. That helps explain why the final messages sound so composed. "We are holding our own" may have been true in the narrow sense available to McSorley at that moment. Pumps were running. The vessel was still making way. The crew was still functioning. Whitefish Bay was still ahead. But if flooding in the cargo hold had already advanced further than he knew, then the phrase becomes tragic in a very particular way. It is not false bravado. It is a report from a captain working with incomplete information in a brutal environment. Some questions remained smaller but still stubborn. Did the failure of the Whitefish point light and radio beacon matter in a decisive way? The Coast Guard report makes clear that the Whitefish point light and radio beacon were indeed not operating that evening and could not be restored immediately, though the light had at one point appeared to be operating before the monitoring system again indicated failure. Those outages clearly added uncertainty during a hard approach, but there is no official conclusion that the navigational aid failure alone caused the sinking. It belongs more in the category of aggravating confusion than full explanation. Still, when a damaged ship without radar is trying to make for shelter, every missing aid feels larger than it would on an ordinary day. Another question concerned cargo shift. If the taconite had shifted badly, could that have created or worsened the list? The Coast Guard materials discussed the physical properties of taconite pellets and noted no evidence that surface or internal moisture significantly affected angle of repose under normal service conditions, and no reported instances of taconite cargo shifting in normal service. That does not make cargo behaviour irrelevant under extreme sinking conditions, but it does make the cargo just shifted a weaker explanation than some others. The investigators did not find strong support for treating cargo shift as the main cause. And of course there is the question everybody circles back to eventually. Why no distress call? That one may never be fully answerable. The best inference from the evidence is that the final loss of survivable control happened very quickly. But quickly is a slippery word. quickly after hours of worsening conditions, quickly after known damage, quickly after the ship had already lost both radars and developed a bad list, quickly enough that no mayday followed. All of those things can be true at once. The ship may have been in trouble for a long time and still have had its final fatal transition happen too fast for the bridge crew to transmit anything more. That is why the questions left behind are so durable, not because there was no evidence, but because the evidence points in overlapping directions. The official reports strongly favour flooding and loss of buoyancy, especially through ineffective or overwhelmed closures in a vessel already damaged and riding low. The shoal theory remains plausible enough to keep returning, especially because of the chart and hydrographic questions north of Caribou Island. The weather theory remains indispensable, because later analysis showed the ship likely encountered some of the storm's worst local conditions right where and when it was lost. Structural breakup on the surface remains less favoured by the official evidence, even though the broken wreck encourages that picture in the public mind. So when people ask what really happened, the most honest answer is not a neat one-liner. It is that the Fitzgerald was probably not defeated by only one thing. It was likely hurt, made vulnerable, driven lower, and then finished by a combination of water, sea force, and design limits that narrowed its margin until there was no margin left. The precise order of those blows is where the argument lives. The broad fact of them is where most serious readers end up agreeing, and maybe that is why the case has stayed alive for so long. It is not merely a mystery in the cheap sense. It is a serious historical problem with real men inside it, a famous ship, a violent lake, and just enough uncertainty left over to keep every new generation leaning toward the same question. The reports gave the world a probable cause. The wreck gave the world a shape. The weather studies gave the world a harsher picture of the storm. The families and mariners kept the human weight attached to all of it. But even after all that, one thing remained true. There was still a difference between the best explanation and complete knowledge. Which means that before we leave the Fitzgerald for the night, there is still one more thing to do. And it is the thing people have been trying to do since November 1975, which is to gather all of this together. The ship, the crew, the storm, the damage, the silence, the wreck, the official findings and the doubts that survived them, and ask one last time as carefully as possible what really happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald. So, after all of that, after the ship, the crew, the route, the weather, the radio calls, the search, the wreck, and the decades of argument, what really happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald? The most honest answer is that we know the broad shape of the disaster much better than we know its exact final sequence. That may sound like a dodge, but it is not. It is the most accurate way to put it. The official investigations did not conclude that the loss was unknowable. They concluded that the ship was overwhelmed by flooding and loss of buoyancy in extreme storm conditions, but they also made clear that the exact final chain of events could not be completely reconstructed because there were no survivors and no eyewitnesses to the last moments. The NTSB's 1978 report said the probable cause was sudden massive flooding of the cargo hold due to the collapse of one or more hatch covers after earlier damage and flooding had already reduced freeboard and produced a list. The Coast Guard's earlier report likewise pointed to loss of buoyancy from massive flooding of the cargo hold, tied to ineffective hatch closure. Both reports agree on the central point that water got in, the ship lost buoyancy, and the end came fast. That is where I would begin, because it is the strongest ground in the case. Not with a rogue wave, not with a dramatic snap in half on the surface, and not with a purely romantic idea of the lake simply taking a ship by mystery alone. The strongest answer is that the Fitzgerald was already in trouble before the final catastrophe, that it was getting lower in the water, and that once a ship in those conditions starts losing its margin, a Great Lakes storm can finish the job quickly. The earlier radio traffic fits that reading very well. McSorley reported topside damage, a bad list, lost vents, both pumps running, and later the loss of both radars. He also said he was taking heavy seas over the deck, and that he was in one of the worst seas he had ever seen. Those are not the words of a ship that is suddenly destroyed out of perfect health. They are the words of a ship already suffering physical damage and already fighting worsening conditions before the final silence. That matters because it pushes the best explanation away from a single clean event and toward a progression. First damage, then increasing vulnerability, then flooding serious enough that the ship could no longer survive it. And that progression also explains why the final message, "We are holding our own," remains so haunting. It may well have been true in the narrow immediate sense. The ship was still moving, the crew was still functioning, the bridge was still communicating, but the official reports suggest McSorley may not have had a full picture of how much flooding was already developing in the cargo hold. The NTSB specifically argued that the master probably did not realise the extent of flooding there until the water level exceeded the height of the cargo. That is a terrible possibility, because it means the ship could still sound controlled from the bridge while the real loss of survival margin was already underway below. So if I had to give one careful, plain English conclusion, it would be this. The Edmund Fitzgerald was likely damaged before the final plunge, likely took on water in more than one way, likely rode lower and more dangerously as the storm intensified, and then suffered a rapid final flooding event that ended the fight before a distress call could be sent. Now, that still leaves the obvious next problem. What caused the earlier damage in the first place? This is where the certainty drops. The official NTSB answer leaned toward topside damage plus ineffective, or eventually overwhelmed hatch protection, leading to reduced freeboard, a list, and then massive flooding after one or more hatch covers failed under the loads of heavy boarding seas. That is still the most authoritative single explanation in the record. It has the advantage of fitting the reported list, the reported damage, the worsening weather, and the abruptness of the end. It also fits the lack of a mayday, because once the cargo hold begins flooding catastrophically on a ship like that, events can move too quickly for a proper distress transmission. But the reason the case never fully settled is that not everyone accepted that explanation as complete. One reason is practical and human. The hatch cover theory was heard by some people as an accusation against the crew, especially the deckhands and officers responsible for securing the hatches. That caused real pain among families and former shipmates, and later reporting has noted how strongly many of them rejected the idea that the Fitzgerald would have gone out in late season weather with its hatch clamps carelessly handled. Smithsonian's recent review of the case points out that this theory has remained controversial for exactly that reason, and that some former crewmen who knew the ship insisted the first mate would never have allowed those covers to be left unsecured in November. That does not automatically make the official theory wrong. It simply means that hatch problem and crew negligence are not the same thing, and they should not be treated as the same thing. A hatch system can be inadequate even if the men using it are careful. Closures can become ineffective under extraordinary conditions even if they were properly handled at departure. A vessel can also be damaged in a way that changes the loads those closures later face. Those distinctions matter. They are the difference between saying the ship was badly designed for what it met, saying it was physically compromised before the end, and saying the crew simply failed to do basic work. The evidence does not support the lazy version of that last claim. Then there is the shoaling theory, the idea that the Fitzgerald struck bottom or raked a shoal near Caribou Island, especially around 6 Fathom Shoal or nearby shallow areas. This theory has remained alive because it explains a lot of things at once. It could explain topside damage. It could explain the reported list. It could explain why the ship seemed seriously hurt before the final sinking. It could also fit Captain Cooper's concern that the Fitzgerald had passed dangerously close to shallow water. The Coast Guard treated this seriously enough to examine hydrographic conditions in that area, and later writing, including Smithsonian's, notes that some researchers still find this explanation persuasive or at least plausible. But plausible is not the same as proven. That is the problem. The shoal theory has always had a strong practical appeal, but it has never produced the one decisive piece of evidence that would make the argument stop. It remains a reasonable possibility, especially as part of a larger chain of damage, but it was not adopted as the final official cause. So the careful version is not. The Fitzgerald definitely struck bottom and that settled everything. The careful version is, shoaling remains one credible explanation for how the ship may have been damaged and made vulnerable before the final flooding, but it has never been conclusively established. And then there is the storm itself. The weather is not a side note in this case, it is one of the main facts. Later reanalysis by Hultquist and colleagues, summarised by the National Weather Service, found that the worst conditions were coincident with the time and place of the Fitzgerald's loss, with sustained winds near storm force and significant waves above 25 feet, near where the vessel disappeared. Smithsonian's 2025 review adds that some expert estimates have suggested the ship may have encountered waves far larger than the average figures imply, possibly 2 or 3 near 50 feet, and perhaps even 1 or 2 around 60 feet. Whether you accept the highest estimates or stay with the more conservative modelled values, the larger point is the same. The Fitzgerald appears to have reached one of the storm's worst local zones at just about the worst possible time. That matters because weather does not have to be the only cause in order to be decisive. In fact, the most likely reading is that weather was the force that turned a damaged and vulnerable ship into a lost one. A ship with no damage might survive very severe conditions. A ship with minor damage might survive moderate conditions. A ship that is already listing, already low, already taking heavy water over the deck, already missing radar, and already under repeated heavy wave loading is living on something much smaller than confidence. It is living on whatever margin remains. And Lake Superior in those conditions was not likely to leave much margin for long. That is why I do not think the clean, rogue wave did it version is the best answer either. It is too simple. A huge wave, or a sequence of huge waves, may absolutely have been part of the final mechanism. It may even have been the immediate trigger that pushed the ship past recovery. But the Fitzgerald had already been telling the world, in the quiet language of working sailors, that it had problems before the radio stopped. The reported list, damaged vents, reduced speed, and request for the Anderson to stay by all came before the final disappearance. So the better reading is not, one giant wave out of nowhere sank a healthy ship. The better reading is, extreme wave conditions likely struck a ship that was already compromised. The wreck on the bottom supports that broader picture too. The ship was found in 2 major pieces, but the NTSB did not interpret that as proof that it snapped apart on the surface in the storm. Instead, it argued that the bow and stern positions suggested the Fitzgerald sank in one piece and then broke apart either as it descended or when it hit bottom. That weakens the popular image of a dramatic above-water structural breakup as the main explanation. The broken wreck proves violence. It does not prove the whole drama people often imagine. The same is true of the lack of a distress call. People naturally treat that absence as though it must point to one very specific kind of event, but it does not. What it points to most strongly is speed at the end. The Coast Guard report itself cautioned that whatever the exact sequence was, the end was so rapid and catastrophic that there was no time to warn the crew, launch boats or rafts, put on life jackets in an organised way, or make a distress call. That is a very powerful statement because it narrows the field of likely endings even if it does not identify a single mechanical trigger. The ship may have been in worsening trouble for hours, but the final transition from still afloat to past saving seems to have happened very fast, and that, to me, is one of the most important things to understand if you want the plainest truth available. The Fitzgerald was not a case of a ship going cheerfully along and then simply vanishing by magic. It was a case of a ship already under severe stress, already reporting damage, already trying to make Whitefish Bay, and then suffering a final catastrophic loss quickly enough that there was no final radio cry. That is what, without a cry, really means here. Not that the ship had offered no warning. It had. It means there was no last formal alarm after the warnings had already begun. So what really happened? My best, most careful answer is this. The Edmund Fitzgerald probably encountered a chain of failures rather than one single isolated cause. Somewhere before the end, it appears to have suffered real physical damage, whether from heavy seas alone, from impact with shoaling, or from some combination of weather and route conditions that left the ship compromised. That damage, together with ineffective or eventually overwhelmed watertight protection, allowed water to get in and reduce the ship's freeboard while producing a list. As the storm worsened and the vessel reached some of the worst local conditions on the lake, heavy boarding seas imposed larger and larger loads on a ship that was already lower, more vulnerable and less able to keep the lake out. At some point, the final flooding event came, most likely through failure or collapse of hatch protection over the cargo hold, and once that happened, the end was too rapid for any useful distress call. That answer leaves uncertainty in place, but it does not leave us empty-handed. It tells us the disaster was probably progressive before it became sudden. It tells us the weather was not just background scenery, but a main active force. It tells us the ship's final vulnerability was likely tied to flooding and reduced buoyancy, not merely to a dramatic structural snap on the surface. It tells us that the hatch cover debate matters, but should not be simplified into a careless crew story. It tells us that shoaling remains possible, maybe even important, but unproven. And it tells us that the final silence was the silence of a ship already in trouble, not the silence of a mystery with no clues at all. I think that matters, because famous disasters often drift into two bad habits over time. One habit is overconfidence, where people start speaking as though a contested case is settled beyond doubt. The other is theatrical mystery, where people speak as though nothing can be known, and the whole thing belongs to myth. The Fitzgerald deserves better than both. We do know important things. We know the ship was in serious distress before the end. We know the storm was ferocious and locally worse than many earlier summaries captured. We know the vessel lost buoyancy and went down rapidly. We know the wreck supports a catastrophic sinking followed by breakup during descent or impact. And we know the exact last mechanical sequence remains beyond complete proof. That is not emptiness. That is a serious historical answer with a hard edge of uncertainty still attached to it. And maybe that is why this story continues to hold people so strongly. Not just because a giant ship sank. Big ships have sunk before. Not just because a famous song was written. Songs have been written before. It stays because this case sits in a very uncomfortable place between knowledge and absence. There is enough evidence to understand the disaster in broad terms, but not enough to erase the feeling of those last minutes disappearing into dark water. There is enough to know the lake did not simply swallow a healthy vessel whole, but not enough to point to a single final instant and say, there, that was the one exact thing. So when people still ask what really happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald, I do not think the best answer is a dramatic one. I think the best answer is a quiet one. A damaged ship in one of the worst parts of a November storm got lower in the water than it could safely afford. Water kept getting in. The lake kept pressing. The margin disappeared. And then, very quickly, so did the ship. That is not a simple ending, but it is probably the truest one we have. And maybe that is where the story rests best. Not in total certainty, because the evidence does not give us that. Not in total mystery, because the evidence gives us more than that. Just in the cold, difficult middle ground where history often lives. 29 men aboard a famous freighter. A hard lake in November. A vessel already showing signs of trouble. A final run toward Whitefish Bay. And a loss that was real, rapid and violent enough that the world was left with official findings, broken steel on the bottom, and one last human fact that no later theory has ever changed, which is that whatever combination of damage, flooding and storm force finally took the Fitzgerald, it took her with all hands and left everyone else to do the only thing still possible afterward, which was to study the evidence carefully, remember the men clearly, and keep telling the story without pretending it was either simpler or stranger than it really was.